in the US from live from the couch, joining us to present the materialist perspective. And then Michael Egnor, aka Mike, who is a Christian neurosurgeon, who is joining us to present a theistic and scientific perspective. Let me just pause the stream so I'm not hearing myself speaking. Welcome to both of you. Welcome both of you to the channel. So today's discussion, polite discussion, not a savage debate, a polite discussion, is whether materialism is the best explanation for the human mind, whether materialism is the best that we can do to explain the human mind, or whether there is a better explanation. And T-Jump's taking the affirmative in this one, that materialism is definitely, but without a doubt, the best explanation that we have today on August the 20th, 2021 for the human mind. And gentlemen, if I could ask you, when you make your opening statements, perhaps just to say a little bit about yourself for the viewers who are encountering you for the very first time. So T-Jump, would you like to take it away with the opening statement?
Sure. I am T-Jump. I am Josh's sugar mama. We have a OnlyFans, private OnlyFans that anyone can check out on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/T-Jump. But yeah, so the debate today is materialism the best explanation of consciousness? I would say yes. And the reason I would say yes is because it's kind of the only one that we've got. Like, we don't have any other evidence of any other ontology that exists whatsoever. As far as I know, the only evidence that have been presented for alternatives is that we can't explain stuff with materialism, therefore object B, which is just an argument from ignorance. Saying that consciousness is fundamental doesn't actually explain anything about what consciousness is, or how it does, or how it works, or why there's intentionality, or why we can't explain things with materialism. It's just saying, oh, here's something we can't explain, therefore it's fundamental. But that doesn't answer any questions. It doesn't tell us anything about anything. It's just like basic brute facts. If you say X is a brute fact, I mean, well, what do we do with it? How does this help us answer any questions? It doesn't. It just. And the question is even if you say it's a kind of a brute fact or a fundamental thing, why not think it could just be a composite we just haven't discovered yet? Like, what is the reason for thinking it's a brute thing other than the fact that we just can't explain it yet? It seems like the idealists and dualists are essentially just taking the fact that we can't explain something, or don't in principle know how to explain something yet, can't think of a way to explain it, and saying, it must be fundamental. It can't be a composite. But that seems very strange. Seems like something that most God of the gaps arguments kind of use, where we can't explain it, therefore it's this new kind of a thing. But just like the typical UFO analogy used by Neil deGrasse Tyson, if you say something is an unidentified flying object, you can't then immediately label it aliens, because it's a contradiction to say it's unidentified and then identify it. So if we don't have an explanation for consciousness, simply saying that it's fundamental or some kind of its own ontology isn't actually an explanation. You're just essentially just labeling the unknown thing as a category with, as far as I know, no justifiable basis for such a thing. Right now, all of the evidence we have, the best evidence we have, is that the physical stuff affects our consciousness, but our consciousness doesn't affect the physical stuff. When we zap your brain, we make things happen, and we can make potentially anything happen in your brain if we know the correct places to zap it. And essentially nothing you can think of can really affect the physical world pretty much in any way other than making your arms move. Like, I can't lift my TV up. I can't use the force to project into the future or predict the lottery numbers. Your consciousness really has limited to no power in the world. So when we're asking, like, what is the more plausible explanation of consciousness, the first thing we want to know is, well, what level is consciousness at in the hierarchy of stuff that exists? And right now, given physics, we think physics is probably a pretty accurate model of the level of things that exist. For example, there are protons and neutrons and electrons and atoms, and then chemistry, and below the protons and electrons there's quarks and bosons and fermions, and below that is quantum fields. And so we have this hierarchy of things that exist, and the most base level right now is like quantum fields of some kind, emergent space-time or whatever. And we want to know, well, where is the consciousness? Is the consciousness more at the level of like the quantum fields of some fundamental thing in reality, or is it more at the level of brains, where it's a composite of fundamental stuff that we just don't understand yet? And I think that we have no reason to think it's more fundamental like quantum stuff, and we have every reason to think it's more like a composite like brains. And so it's if it's a more like a composite like brains, then it doesn't make a difference whether it's made of material stuff or soul stuff, proto-conscious particles or whatever. Either way, you're going to get all the exact same problems, and neither model can solve them. But it's always better to go with a model that has a basis in reality. Like we have great evidence that matter exists. We have no evidence that proto-consciousness exists, and so it's going to be like if you see a footprint in the snow, what caused the footprint? A horse or a unicorn? Well, horse is always the better answer here. So if we don't understand consciousness, and all of the best evidence we have is for material stuff, and material stuff seems to supersede consciousness and affect consciousness directly, it seems like, yeah, consciousness is probably a result of physical stuff, and positing it to be anything else doesn't seem to solve any problems. And that's why materialism is the best solution to what is consciousness. And I will conclude there.
Okay. Thank you. My own perspective, I'll just give a sort of just a little brief biographical sketch. I was an atheist and a materialist for the 45 years of my life. I loved science. I was a biochemistry major in college, and I had some questions about biochemistry that bothered me, although it didn't really affect my materialism and atheism at the time, in that understanding living systems seemed to imply that there was a purposefulness, a directedness to the processes that go on within them, that really implied a mind that was guiding things. I didn't see how all these chemicals just mix together in a cell or mix together in a test tube could do the kind of orchestrated things that living things did. So I was still a materialist and an atheist. Medical school, I was fascinated with the brain. I really wanted neurological medicine. I studied neuroanatomy and neurophysiology because I really felt that I was going to be able to understand what it meant to be human, and what the human mind, or metaphorically what the human soul was, if I could understand the brain itself. So as I got to know the brain pretty well, I realized that I really didn't understand particularly any more about human beings. I understood more about their brains, but I didn't get any kind of insight. And went through quite a few intellectual and spiritual changes, and ultimately converted to Christianity, and have embraced dualism, particularly Thomistic dualism. As a neurosurgeon, I found, and I still find, and I've been practicing for 35 years, that there is an enormous range of mental phenomena that are essentially impossible to explain using material precept. And I'll go into that in a great deal of detail. And there are two bases for this impossibility of materialist explanation. One is logical. There are tremendous logic problems with materialism as a metaphysical framework for understanding it, and experimental issues. That is, there are many of the most important experiments in modern neuroscience point very clearly to a dual interpretation of the mind-body relationship. So the three things that have led me away from materialism and into dualism regarding the mind-brain relationship, first of all, is the observation that the mind is metaphysically simple. And by metaphysical simplicity, I mean that the mind cannot be split in the same way that matter can be split. You can split the brain into any number of pieces, but a human being are split in terms of their mind, their soul, their consciousness. There can be different aspects of consciousness, more than one person, no matter what you do to them. Simplicity is a characteristic of immaterial things, not of things. There's been a great deal of research along by Roger Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize for investigating split brain surgery. And we can talk about that in much more detail. Justine Surgeon, who's a researcher at McGill, who's looked at these patients, and somebody on Yars Pinto, another researcher that's looked at that. And what they find is that when you split the brain surgically to treat seizures, there is an aspect of human consciousness that remains unsplit and is capable of functioning even though the substrates in the brain that appear to give rise to it are separated. So there clearly is an immaterial aspect to the human mind just based on research involving metaphysical simplicity. The second line of reasoning that I think supports my view that consciousness can only be explained in a non-materialistic way is that perception and qualia, the first-person experience of what we experience in everyday life, the taste of coffee, the sound of music, that first-person experience has no correlate in materialistic explanations. That is, that you can search the brain down to the quantum level and find nothing in the brain that would lead you to think that this is something that is mediating first-person experience. Now, not to say that the brain is not necessary for first-person experience. I think it is. Obviously, there are many parts of the brain that you need to function normally. I'm saying it's not sufficient. I'm saying there are other aspects of the human brain that make the mind what it is. The third thing is that leads me to think that consciousness cannot be explained materialistically, is our ability to have abstract thoughts, to conceive of things, to have thoughts about things that aren't purely physical things. A very good example of this is logic. That is, that we can make propositions that are connected by logical connections, modus ponens, modus tollens, etc. Yet there are no logical connections in the physical understanding of the brain. The brain is connected by electromagnetism, and Newton's laws, and quantum mechanics, etc. There's no logic in there. So logical connections, which are inherent to mental processes, can't really arise from materialistic processes because there's no logic in materialistic processes. And there are many examples of this sort. So there's a ton of logical and scientific reasons to believe that consciousness cannot be explained purely materialistically. The second basic problem I have with materialist understanding of the mind is intentionality, which Tom referred to earlier. The idea, intentionality is the concept that was championed by Franz Brentano, who was a 19th century German philosopher, who pointed out that the fundamental characteristic of mental states, that they're intentional, which means that they're about things, whereas material things are never about intrinsically, they're just what they are. And mental states being about things have a characteristic that physical states never have. The physical state by itself never refers to anything else, it's only itself. So the very cornerstone of what the mind is, which is intentionality, the capacity for aboutness, transcends matter and is not material. The third reason that I'm a dualistic or even idealistic, although dualistic is my own viewpoint, and reject a materialistic view of the mind, is the reality of free will. We clearly have free will. Human beings, that's a part of our toolkit. Denying it is, I think, just bizarre. And it's even self-refuting. That is, if we are wholly determined by our physical nature, by the chemical processes in our brain, by our environment, then we're meat robots. And meat robots don't really warrant being paid attention to in debates. That is, if what we're saying simply sort of accretions of physical processes going on inside our brains, we have no reason to ascribe truth to those processes. A great deal.
Internets.
Which is based on Aristotle's hylomorphic understanding of nature.
Sorry, you just cut out. You cut out for a minute there, so we lost you. Could you go back a few minutes and start over? Or I think it might help if you turn off your camera.
Yeah, that might be a good idea if you could turn off your camera, Mike.
I think he's. I don't think he's still breaking up. You might want send him a message, maybe. Yes. Yes. You cut out for a few minutes.
Yeah,
We
sure.
lost you.
Yeah, the internet bandwidth looks pretty low where
Oh,
you
wow.
are.
Okay. So turn off my camera. All right.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
might
that?
increase the power of the
Decrease.
stream.
Okay.
Decrease.
All right. Should I take up
The
where
last
to lose me?
thing I heard you say was free will, because talking about meat robots is not
Oh, yeah.
worth
Meat.
Yeah,
paying
you're a
attention
meat
to.
robot, T-Jump.
robots.
It's not worth debating
All
with
right.
you.
That's right. Well, if free will isn't real, then I'm a meat robot too. So we're all meat robots, and who would ever listen to a conversation between meat robots? Yes. So free will has to be real if you can have a meaningful conversation and if what you say has any truth value. And there's plenty of neuroscientific evidence for, particularly the research of Benjamin Libet, who studied free will in the mid-20th century, and Wilder Penfield, who is a neurosurgeon who also studied free will. And I'd be happy to discuss those in detail. My own viewpoint is Thomistic dualism, which is a deep subject. I'm happy to talk a lot about it. I don't want to take too much time here. Thomistic dualism is the viewpoint that the intellect and the will are immaterial powers of the soul, and sensation, perception, emotion, and memory are all material powers, and they do indeed come from the brain in a real sense. But intellect and will are immaterial powers that for which the brain is necessary but not sufficient. And I think that's the most reasonable way to look at the mind and the brain relationship. That's it. Thank you.
Cool. So we're going into open dialogue now, Josh. Are you paying attention?
Paying attention to these lit comments. Meat robot pride worldwide. Meat robots unite. It struck a nerve. Resonated with the crowd. Yeah, let's go to. I do want to know more about this mystical idealism, but we can get to that a little bit later, I think. But yeah, do you want to respond to that? There were 3 great points there, T-Jump, which savagely demolished your position about materialism.
Yeah, so I mean, I could just grant all 3, and none of those would be evidence of dualism or idealism. It's just saying, oh, here are things materialism can't explain. Like, okay, that doesn't mean that dualism or idealism can explain them. Essentially, again, even if we accepted that those 3 things are things materialism couldn't explain, I think they can explain all of them just fine. That wouldn't be evidence of a new thing. It would just be things that we can't explain yet. It could always be the case that we discover some new part of physics that has intentionality, free will, and abstract components to it, and it was like, oh yeah, this now it can explain it. We couldn't explain it before because we just didn't know this about physics, so it's perfectly fine. So assuming that it's impossible to explain these things because our current conception of physics is unable to explain them is just conceptually not very strong, because like obviously we don't know everything. Like we don't even know, like, to put it in, to quote Thomas Edison, we only know 1/1,000,000th of 1% of anything. So saying that physics today can't conceptually explain this, therefore it's literally logically impossible to ever explain this with physics, just doesn't follow. So those would be my first 2 questions for Mike, is like, even if we granted that we couldn't explain these things with current materialism, why would you think this would apply to all possible materialism in the future that we haven't discovered yet? And why would saying that this is a fundamental essence of any kind be an answer to any of these questions?
Sure. Well, first of all, the statement that your theory will explain things in the future, although it doesn't explain it now, isn't really an argument, it's a promise. And so you haven't really made a point there. You've just said everybody should just calm down and trust you, and maybe, in 100 years, maybe you'll be able to explain things. What we're looking for is explanations
it's an inductive argument. So that would be an inductive argument.
No, it's not inductive. It's just a promise. Inductive arguments take the best evidence and put it together to draw the most logical conclusion. And there's no reason to conclude that materialism is true based on the evidence we have now. How do you define matter?
How do I define matter? It's the stuff we can interact with and demonstrate with math and physics.
Okay, so matter is quantifiable.
Sure.
Sure. So how is my perception of red quantifiable? That is,
No
how
idea.
is a mental state quantifiable?
No idea, but it could be. I think you froze again.
I thought he was speechless after your last point.
Just define matter. I'm sorry. Oh,
you dropped out again, Mike.
Okay.
Maybe if you
I'll
turn the camera off.
I'll keep the camera off. So if you find matter as something that's as stuff that's quantifiable, which actually I agree with you. I think it is the best that materialists can do. Although materialists notoriously have tremendous difficulty really defining matter, even defining materialism, and to the point where it gets called physicalism. People throw other terms because they're really confused about what they're talking about. But if materialism, or if matter rather, is something that's quantifiable, something that's extended in space, as Descartes argued, frankly rules out everything mental, because nothing mental is quantifiable, nothing mental is extended in space. So right there, materialism can't explain the mind. It's starting to seem to be the end of the argument.
Well, yeah, so I disagree with that. That seems fairly obvious to me, is that when we say matter is quantifiable, that's an epistemic definition. We're defining it based off of how we see it, not how it is. So it doesn't tell us anything about the ontology of matter. And so even if it would be wrong to limit the capabilities of matter simply to how we see it, that would be like saying we can only see galaxies with telescopes, therefore galaxies are fundamentally made of telescopes. Like, obviously not. Obviously there's more to the galaxy than the fact that we can see it through telescopes. So the fact that consciousness, or the fact that matter can only be experienced through measurements, doesn't mean that that tells us everything about what matter fundamentally is. That just is our epistemic means to assess what it is given our limitations. So that definition is simply giving primacy to our epistemic means and then not going beyond that.
Right. Well, I think in order to claim that materialism is an adequate explanation for the mind, you necessarily have to go beyond epistemic means, because what we know now of the mind and of matter, it can't explain it in any way. So perhaps the explanation is indeed hidden in some unobservable ontological realm, and I wish you the best of luck with that. But the realm we live in now, which is the real world, matter cannot explain the mind in any sense.
All right, so I totally agree with you. I say that current materialism is not sufficient to explain everything. I fully agree. But the reason this is an inductive argument, yeah, well, I mean, yeah, we can't fully explain anything. We're again, Thomas Edison, we only know 1/millionth of 1% of anything. So why this is an inductive argument and a successful one is because we do have good reason to believe matter is real. We have no reason to believe consciousness is a fundamental thing at all. So it's like, if I want to say what caused the footprint in the snow and I see nothing around, I see no animals anywhere around, I don't know what kind of animals live here, the best answer is to posit animals we already know exist at other points on the planet and not posit mythical beings like unicorns.
How do you know matter is right? How do you know matter is real? What is it in your experience that tells you it's real?
Novel testable predictions.
Through your mind.
Yes, through my mind.
Right. So it is your mind that through which you are able to see matter, to understand matter. So it would seem to me that the mind is a much more fundamental thing. That is, that you never see matter or understand matter except when you use your mind. So why would you think the mind is secondary rather than fundamental? It would seem to me, if anything, that matter is secondary, which in fact what idealists have argued for centuries, and I think they kind of have a point. The one thing that we have direct access to is our mind. Everything else is indirect, including our knowledge of matter.
Sure. So our knowledge of other galaxies is indirect through telescopes. Does that mean that telescopes are more fundamental than other galaxies? Well, obviously not. The fact that we can only see things through some...
The analogy here is our mind is not the telescope. Our mind is the astronomer looking through the telescope, and
right, but it applies the same way
immediately. No, no, it doesn't. We experience our mind immediately, directly, whereas we don't experience matter directly. We always experience matter through a filter, through our eyes or through our ears or through our comprehension, but we experience our mind immediately and directly. So why is the mind secondary then? It would seem to me that mind is primary.
Because immediacy
And in
makes
fact,
no difference to the argument. Immediacy is irrelevant. So the argument is that we don't experience other galaxies directly ever. We only experience them through a medium of telescopes. Does that imply that telescopes are more fundamental than galaxies? No. The time duration of whether it's immediate or delayed makes no difference to the argument. So saying that we immediately experience our conscious experience tells us nothing. It's just like, okay. So it doesn't make a difference if it's immediate or not. The analogy works the exact same way, that we don't experience the stuff directly. We experience it through a medium, and that medium is the telescope. So why does the fact that we can only experience galaxies through a medium, why would that imply that the medium is more fundamental than the thing we're experiencing?
Because your personal experience of reality is not a medium. It's the experience itself. That is, that you're not you don't, and Wittgenstein made this argument, and I think it's a very profound argument, that our experience of ourself is not a kind of knowledge. That is, we don't know our own minds in the sense of knowing a book. We experience them. We have them. We are them. It's very clear, I think, in everyday experience that mind is a very fundamental thing. And that matter we only know through our minds, but the mind is fundamental.
Okay, I'm not seeing how that answers my question. Because my analogy is, okay, so we only experience matter through our experience. We only experience other galaxies through telescopes. Your argument is therefore consciousness is fundamental, and I can just use the exact same argument, therefore telescopes are fundamental to other galaxies. I'm not seeing the structural difference here between the arguments that seem to be one-to-one correlation.
The analogy with telescopes is not a good analogy. The astronomer experiences the galaxy through the telescope. The telescope is an aid to it. I'm not saying your mind is an aid to things. I'm saying that your primary experience of things is mental, not physical, it's mental. And that primary experience of things, if you're going to attribute fundamentality to either mind or matter, it would seem that mind has the edge there. As I said,
So,
matter we understand through our mind, but mind is not experienced necessarily through matter.
So my objection here is an objection of form. I'm criticizing the form of your argument. So saying it's fundamental doesn't make a difference here. I'm saying your argument has the form. We experience X through a medium. Therefore, the medium is more fundamental than whatever the thing we're experiencing is. Now, it doesn't matter if it's going to be consciousness and matter or telescopes and galaxies. If the form of your argument is that there is a thing that we are experiencing through a medium, therefore the medium must necessarily be more fundamental, it would also apply to telescopes. So saying that telescopes aren't fundamental is irrelevant here, because I'm criticizing the form of your argument. It doesn't follow that because we're experiencing something that the experience we have is more fundamental.
You're misunderstanding the analogy. The analogy to the mind here is the astronomer, not the telescope.
Well, it's my analogy. So the telescope is my analogy.
It's the observer. I claim it too. I claim it too. The analogy that I'm pointing out is that the mind is the astronomer, not the telescope. The telescope's helping
you can't straw man my argument by trying to take it and make it something else. So you have to address my argument, not your straw man of my argument.
Does your telescope galaxy analogy include an astronomer?
Sure, I guess. Okay,
so let's talk about the astronomer.
Well, no, that's a straw man. So you're straw manning my argument again here.
What do you mean by that? I'm not understanding.
A straw man. Well, so a straw man is when you take someone else's argument and you misrepresent it to attack a point they didn't make. So I made a very specific point.
No, I'm representing your argument very clearly by pointing out your fallacy. Your fallacy
Which fallacy?
is that you're leaving out the astronomer, which is the true analogy to the mind. The telescope
What?
is not the analogy. That's simply the tool that the astronomer uses to see the galaxy. I'm saying the mind is the astronomer, the telescope.
Well, I don't care what you're saying. I care what I'm saying, because we're talking about my argument here. So I don't know which fallacy you think that is, but that's not a fallacy. But my argument is that your argument objectively fails because the structure of your argument is that we experience something through a medium, therefore the medium must be more fundamental. This is demonstrably false. Experiencing something through a medium does not mean the medium is more fundamental than the thing being experienced. That we can prove this false. Telescopes and galaxies.
In your analogy of the astronomer, the telescope, and the galaxy, who is it that is doing the experiencing?
That doesn't matter to the argument here. So literally.
Okay, Tom. Why don't you just throw up your hands? All right. The experiencing is the astronomers, not the telescope. Okay, you seem to leave the part of it, which is typical of a materialist. You have a whole analogy of looking at galaxies through telescopes, and you don't even have a person in your analogy. Yes, if it weren't for people, materialism might work just fine. All right,
so you're evading the question.
No, I'm kind of attacking your analogy, and it's a pretty obvious attack. You're leaving out the astronomer.
No, so I can make it a computer doing the observing, and the exact same thing holds. So a computer is looking through a telescope.
Computers don't look through telescopes.
Yes,
People
they do.
Use people use computers to look through telescopes.
No. I don't think you're understanding here.
You're trying to get an infinite recess of machines.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
There's
this is super easy.
At the end of
This is really easy. So a computer does not have the capability to pick up the electrons coming out of alternate universes. In order to be sensitive enough to pick up the electrons from alternate galaxies, not universes, it would need a source, some kind of a medium to be sensitive enough to do that, which is a telescope. So the computer on its own is not sensitive enough to the electrons to pick up electrons from other galaxies. To do that, it needs a medium, which is a telescope. Does that mean that the telescope is more fundamental than the universe that is being seen by the telescope? No. I have proven your argument objectively false. There can be things out there that cannot be seen without a medium.
Right. So how about this? I'll say something that's totally disconnected from your fascinating analogy. And I'll say, imagine that an astronomer is looking through a telescope and maybe even using a computer to do it, to look at galaxies. The fundamental subject first-person experience in that process is that of the astronomer. The tools and machines he uses to observe the galaxies are not themselves any kind of first-person experience. It's only the astronomer that has that experience. So in my analogy, the astronomer is analogous to the mind. And the tools, the telescope, etc., are simply tools that this mind uses to see things. So in my analogy, the astronomer is fundamental to the process of observation.
Okay, let's go with yours then.
Okay, all right, good.
So in your analogy, in your analogy, the consciousness could be a process that is an emergent property of other non-conscious things. So the consciousness was a tool built by non-conscious things, and then it did the experiment. So it's not fundamental. And that would be perfectly consistent.
What do you mean by emergent?
Like hearts are emergent, lungs, organs.
I want a definition, not examples.
New properties that are a result of combinations of things that none of which have those new properties.
So new properties that come from nothing?
No, new properties that come from other things that exist.
Where do the new properties come from?
From other things that exist that don't have those properties.
So how can something that doesn't have properties give other things properties? Where do they get it from?
That's what emergent properties are.
Yeah, there's another word for emergence as you're using it, and that's magic. What you're really saying is that these properties sort of magically come out of things. Emergence is a very, very weak concept. And what emergence basically means is that a collection of lesser entities sometimes manifests behavior on a large scale that is not predictable from the behavior of the entities on the individual scale. But that's a psychological phenomenon, meaning that what it means is that emergence is kind of a surprise. A very good example is if you understand the physics of water molecules. That doesn't really tell you that water feels wet when you actually feel it. So you can say, well, wetness is an emergent property of water, which is true. I mean, that's a common example of emergence. When you look at emergence carefully, though, it's a psychological phenomenon. That is, you don't expect it, but it happens. So emergence presupposes a mind. So emergence can't be an explanation for a mind.
Nope. Emergence is specifically a bunch of essentially particles being affected by one force, but when they conglomerate into a larger collection, they're affected by another force that had a less of effect. And so the second force supersedes the first force. So like if you have a hydrogen atom, it's affected by the strong and weak electromagnetic force, not really affected by gravity that much. If you put a whole bunch of hydrogen atoms together, then gravity starts to overtake the strong and weak electromagnetic forces to apply a new feature, which it becomes a star. And so you have an emergent property of star because the conglomeration of the past thing causes it to be taken over by a new force that was not as prevalent as the previous force, which then has a new effect. None of this is subjective. This is all about things interacting in reality of combining in such a way that a new force takes over from an old force. Essentially, it has nothing to do with subjective experience here.
Yeah, emergence is a psychological phenomenon, and it basically is being surprised things act in the aggregate compared to what we know of how things act in the particular. So you can't explain the mind using a psychological property. If there's
so
no
I just proved that
mind,
false. You just again straw manning me. So I just proved that false. I said emergence is like hydrogen, which is affected by one force. And then when it builds up and there's lots of hydrogen, those previous forces that were guiding the interactions are now superseded by a new force, causing an emergent property in the star. So there's no psychological things in anything I said there.
Yeah, they're not superseded by anything. Those are all forces. Those are all real forces. What makes it emergent is if you didn't expect it in the particular and you find it in the aggregate.
No.
That's the whole point of emergence. So
your straw man of emergence has nothing to do with my worldview. So your straw man of emergence has nothing to do with what I said or how I used the word.
Well,
so how I used the word, it was an emergent property that hydrogen, the weakened strong electromagnetic forces that guided hydrogen in the way it formed, was then overtaken by gravity, which then overpowered those other forces, causing them to crush together and form new particles.
Okay.
So that would be emergent.
What are these? So what are these forces that you're talking about that explain the mind emerging from?
I have no idea. They could just be undiscovered ones that we don't know about yet.
Right. Okay. So you don't have any idea.
Yeah, but it's still a better explanation than dualism or idealism because it's things that have a basis in reality.
You're having no idea has a basis in reality.
Yes. So combinations of things that we know exist is better than combinations of things that have no evidence that exist.
You're saying minds don't exist.
No, I'm saying that minds at being fundamental. There's no evidence of that.
Sure.
Obviously, I think minds exist.
What properties of mind are the same as properties of matter? You know, like we have properties of matter, extension in space. The mind exists. Okay, sure. So besides that, in existence, as Thomas Aquinas would say, is not a property. But what properties do mind and matter share?
He says predicate, but one, they exist. Two, they're probably made of energy of some kind. They can be manipulated by things in the same way. So interactions, physical interactions can make. What?
Mind is made of energy. What sort of energy?
No idea. The kind that causes changes, because that's what
I see. But
energy is essentially in physics.
So
causes changes.
But you said the mind has no causal properties earlier. That's exactly what you.
No, I said it had limited to no causal properties. So I said limited. So like you can cause your arm to move.
Okay, then I misunderstood you. I thought you said it had no causal properties at all. So this energy you're talking about, I don't understand why do you think mind is a kind of energy? What sort of heat
Because
is it heat energy, or I mean, what sort of energy? Kinetic?
I have no idea, but
Potential?
I have no idea. But again, this is just an argument from ignorance, because whether or not I can answer these questions isn't evidence for your position.
Well, I think destroying your position is perfectly adequate here. I just don't. I mean, you're sort of saying things that don't make any sense. So what properties do mind and matter share?
So do you know what an argument from ignorance is? So like
Yeah,
if there are 10,
I'm dealing with one now. Yeah, I'm dealing with one. So what?
Let me just clarify for a second. Let me just clarify. So if there are 10 axles, 10 car axles, and you know the first 9 are broken, does that prove the 10th one works?
No.
Right. So disproving my argument, even if you were successful, isn't evidence of your position. Your axle could still be broken. So it doesn't matter. Asking me questions isn't evidence of your position whatsoever.
Sure. Okay. So if we're looking, well, I mean, obviously, I mean that when you're making an inductive argument, which you've claimed to make, then obviously you're making an induction to best explanation, and showing that one explanation is untenable makes the conclusion that other explanations are more tenable, more reasonable. It's all relative.
No. So if you refute if you show the other axles are broken, that doesn't actually increase the probability that the 10th axle isn't broken. So it doesn't change that. Proving other things false does not make it more likely that yours is true. That's argument from ignorance. But the problem here is that the reason mine is using it's not inference of the best explanation is abduction. That's different from induction. But mine is that because we have lots of evidence of physical stuff interacting, we can make testable predictions. Like we can use this model that if there is material stuff, we can use this to predict the future, and it's successful at this. That is good evidence of material stuff existing. Therefore, it's like saying, we now have past things to go off of that this stuff exists, like horses. There are horses, so if there's a hoof print, we can say it's probably a horse. But if we want to say it's a unicorn, there's no past data that supports the unicorn hypothesis. So to say it's a unicorn, it's going to need more. You got to have more stuff there to justify unicorn, like something new. So in your case, even if you could disprove lots and lots of parts of materialistic hypotheses, it's made testable predictions of the past. So you can't disprove all of it. So it's still going to have a better basis than idealism or dualism, because they've done nothing as far as I know.
Well, as far as you know is the point, because you don't know.
Well, yeah, sure. Like if there was actually evidence of idealism and dualism, it'd be great.
Sure. Let's see. Why don't we start with the Big Bang? Okay. So what was the material cause of the Big Bang?
The amplituhedron and emergent spacetime.
What?
The amplituhedron and the in physics right now, in quantum physics, the current theory is that spacetime itself is emergent from more fundamental material properties. Which one of those theories is called the amplituhedron by Nima Arkani Hamad? Another one is emergent spacetime by Sean Carroll. Another one is string theory. Each of these are physical things.
What are the physical things?
Yes, these are physical things that exist outside of spacetime.
Well, how can something physical exist outside of spacetime?
It's quite easy. So you take the equations of general and special relativity in each of the variables and see if you can.
What space do they exist in if they're outside of spacetime?
They exist in the thing that made space. So
I see, the thing. Okay, so the thing is where this all comes from. Like God?
No, like a physical thing that doesn't have consciousness, like the amplituhedron, like I said at the beginning, amplituhedron.
The amplituhedron, where was this amplituhedron, whatever you call it?
It's the thing that creates space. Like asking where it is not a coherent question here. So it's like, where is water when there is no H2O? Like what? Like,
so
where is H2O?
You've defined matter as something that's quantitative and extended in space, and then you say that.
Well, no, that's our epistemic definition. So remember, matter defined epistemically of how we interact with it is defined that way. That's not the ontology of matter. And so when you're asking about the ontology of matter and then trying to use the epistemic definition, you're not.
How do you know the ontology of matter if you don't interact with it? How do you know it?
We make testable predictions. So we say, Right now, none of these have been proven. They're just
which is
hypotheses.
which right.
But the way we get them is by
right.
the way we get them is by building models that can explain the data. All of these physical models are combinations of principles and particles and laws that have been demonstrated in physics to be real, and they use those and combine them in different ways to see if they can make a model to explain the observable data. So these models are always going to be better than God. They're always going to be better than idealism or dualism because they're limited to only using combinations of things that have been demonstrated to exist in reality. Obviously, they're still hypotheses. We haven't proven any of these, but these are always, these models of emergent space-time and amplitude-hedron are infinitely better than God or consciousness.
In what way is amplitude-hedron better than God? I must have missed that.
Because it's a combination of principles and particles and laws that have been demonstrated to exist in reality, where God is a combination of things that have not been demonstrated to exist in reality.
Wait. You've just said this is all theory. It hasn't been proven. What's your evidence for the amplitude-hedron?
So a theory that is a combination of things that exist is better than a theory with a bunch of made up stuff that has no evidence that exists, right? You would agree with that?
Yeah. Have you ever read Thomas Aquinas?
Yes, I've Thomistic.
Okay.
I debate Thomists all the time.
Are you familiar with his 5 ways?
Yes, motion, cause.
Sure. What's your critique of the first way?
The argument for motion.
Thomas made very, very detailed, strong arguments for God's existence that have exactly the same structure as a theory in natural science. It's actually natural theology. So, what's your problem with the first way?
Well, it doesn't have the same structure as a theory in natural science. It's philosophical.
Of course it does. Wait. No, it's not. Natural theology is not philosophical. Natural theology is a posteriori reasoning. It's inductive reasoning, going from things that exist in nature, making logical inferences about those, and reaching a conclusion to best explanation. That's what all the Thomistic proofs are.
That's abduction, not induction.
No.
Inference to the best explanation is literally abduction.
No, it's not. That's a posteriori reasoning. Abduction is using modus tollens as a basis for reasoning. Modus tollens is if A then B, not B, therefore not A. And abduction is using that basic logical fallacy, which we use in everyday life because it kind of works, even though it's not good logic. Inferential reasoning is taking evidence, putting it together, and arriving at the most reasonable conclusion from it, the inference to best explanation. What's your problem with the first way? Because you've said that.
So first thing, abduction, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, abduction is also called inference to the best explanation. So it's literally exactly what I said.
Okay. Let's get back.
Which is the first way the argument for motion? I don't remember the orders. Is the first way the argument for motion?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say that in quantum mechanics, you can have things that don't have causes.
No. What's your problem with the first way? Aquinas made no reference to quantum mechanics. What's your problem with the first way?
I'd say quantum mechanics refutes his argument that you always need some prior thing from motion. Like you don't need a necessary first mover.
The argument from the first way states that a series of causes that are essential causes, that is, in which the existence of past causes is necessary to continue the process going, cannot go on to infinite regress. That activation, that elevation of potency to act, possibility to actuality, requires something that is fully actual at the beginning of this causal chain to make the chain happen. And that fully actual thing, as Thomas said, is what all men call God. It is an argument that was made originally by Aristotle. It's never been refuted. It is straightforward. It just amazes me that you would say that there are no arguments for God's existence when some of the best arguments ever put forward were Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. They're very strong arguments.
well, objectively pretty terrible. Like, for example, that one can be refuted by quantum mechanics, where not all causes have preceding necessary causes. All effects don't have necessary causes. Like quantum mechanics has effects that are purely random. So you don't need a necessary, or what was it? Pure act.
No,
you don't need a pure act to cause things.
Are you saying that randomness is evidence that there's no cause? What does
you don't need a thing of pure
have
act.
to do? What does randomness have to do with causation? I mean, if you roll a dice and the dice comes up randomly, various numbers, various times, does that mean there's no cause for the dice coming up those numbers?
Well, no, because the dice would presumably be completely determined by physics.
Right. So randomness has nothing to do with causation. Quantum mechanics
that would not be
deals
random.
with randomness. Quantum mechanics deals with statistical probabilities for certain outcomes. It doesn't mean that things aren't caused.
No. So the current consensus in physics is that randomness is actually an existing independent thing. That isn't. It's not just there's a hidden variable there. It's that there's literally randomness itself is a force.
Oh no, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. That's Bell's inequality, and that's been experimentally shown 17 or 18 times at least since the 1970s. You're quite right. Determinism is false, and probabilities indeed exist, and there are no local hidden variables in quantum processes. But you should not mistake randomness for causation. Causation is an entirely different matter. And so when you're going back to a series of causes in Aquinas' first way, you can't go back to infinite regress in an essentially ordered series of causes. There has to be a prime mover. And
right. So my refutation was,
a very good argument.
My refutation was that randomness means it's not an essentially ordered series. That doesn't exist. Secondly, we could just grant there is an essentially ordered series and say it's not God. It's just naturalistic pantheism or any version that doesn't include a mind, and you get rid of God and solve the problem anyway.
I don't know why you're throwing randomness into this. So you're saying that, are you saying that reality came about as a random fluctuation?
Yes, that's the Big Bang. That's the Big Bang. But
Okay.
yeah, so the randomness thing means
Right.
it's not an essentially ordered series, or not entirely an essentially ordered series. That's the point that it's getting rid of. Even though the consensus in physics is that yes, there is a past infinite regress, and that's fine.
Right. The analogy that Aristotle used to an essentially ordered series, which I think is a good analogy, is a person pushing a rock with a stick. And pushing the rock was the change, and the stick was the instrument that the person used, and that you still need a person using the stick. You can't just multiply the sticks to infinity. You can't say, well, the rock got pushed because now I'm saying there's an infinite number of sticks. You still need a person using the stick to push it. But I'm kind of fascinated by your notion that the universe arose without cause. That's a fascinating thing. When you say that there's randomness that gave rise to the universe, I presume you mean a quantum fluctuation that gave rise to it.
Yeah, the empirical demonstration of the Casimir effect that virtual particles exist, and the Big Bang is essentially just a bigger virtual particle.
So you're saying a quantum field is not a cause?
Sure, it could be if you want to call it a cause. I mean, cause is just a vague term that doesn't mean anything in physics, but you just apply it to whatever you want.
Where did the quantum? Well, of course it means things in physics. Cause is what physics is all about, is understanding causes. Where does a quantum field come from?
It's essentially eternal. You could say it's the necessary thing if you want.
Okay, so you're saying the quantum field is fundamental, and it has
sure, if you want to put it that way. Sure, you can put it that way.
Okay, all right. What is it about a mathematical construct like a quantum field that could make it fundamental in a sense?
Well, again, the mathematical construct. What?
Yeah, I mean, what about a mathematical construct like that would lead you to think it's fundamental?
So again, the mathematical construct is the epistemological means. It doesn't tell us about ontology, so it's not irrelevant to the question of whether it's fundamental. The reason we think it's fundamental is because we actually have evidence it exists. We don't have evidence anything else exists. That's more fundamental, so it's the best conclusion of what's fundamental. There's no positing anything else would just be positing things with no evidence, and so it's less supported.
Yeah, but I'm still just fascinated that you think this enormously elegant, beautiful, complex mathematical construct just happens to be there, just kind of came out of nowhere, or doesn't have a cause, and that's what would ever lead you to that conclusion. Do you know any other mathematical constructs that don't have causes, that people don't? I mean,
mathematical constructs are our description of the thing. The math isn't the thing itself. So our description of the thing, it doesn't exist. We just made up a description. The thing itself exists, and we described it with math.
Yeah. So as I said, that particular notion that the most fundamental existing thing is not God, is something that is just an idea or a physical thing. I think that's one of the great weaknesses that natural theologians have attacked, that to really explain the most fundamental thing, you need to make a leap out of the natural world, that the natural world cannot explain itself.
That's like saying God cannot explain himself. Like, you could always say
God
that
isn't
about
a
anything.
part. No, God isn't a part of the natural world, and he doesn't require explanation. He's not
You
a
could
part
just say
of
the
nature.
natural world doesn't require explanation, and you have just as an even better argument.
Well, you have another argument. It's not really a very good argument. So are you saying that the natural world doesn't require an explanation?
Doesn't. So you can say, just like the theist says God doesn't require an explanation, and they just assert this with no evidence, you can just say the same thing. The natural world doesn't require an explanation. It's the necessary thing, and you don't need an explanation of it.
Okay, so that's the position you hold, that the natural world doesn't require an.
Sort of, yeah. I think the natural world is a better necessary thing than a God.
Right. So why do science? Why look for explanations if explanations aren't required?
Because it's fun. I don't understand the question.
Think about it. You've just said the natural world needs no explanation. So why are scientists wasting their time looking for explanations?
Because it's fun. Like, I still don't understand the question. Like, this question's been asked about God. Really... God breaks science. Like, if there's a God, God could just.
I'm not talking about God here. I'm talking about the natural world. And
you've made I'm trying to understand.
You've made an astonishing claim that the natural world requires no explanation. And I'm saying that if the natural world requires no explanation, why look for explanations in the natural world? Why do
We're not required to do science either. Like, I don't understand. Like, you seem to be asking a question of motivation.
I didn't say you're required
why
to
do we enjoy do this?
Right. So why would you even assume there are explanations if the whole thing has no explanation and needs none?
Why would I assume? Because lots of things have had explanations. So, like, if I see, a cup fell over, that was the wind.
So the natural, right? So, but if the whole shebang doesn't need an explanation, then assume there are explanations elsewhere.
Because we've demonstrated them. Cup fell over, wind.
Well, you don't have full knowledge of that. Maybe you're mistaken.
I mean, you mean absolute certainty? We don't need certainty.
No. What we actually know and observe about nature is only a very thin sliver of what goes on out there. And you're making the argument that the whole shebang needs no explanation, which kind of leaves you in the lurch regarding science, because then a scientist could always say, well, the reason this phenomenon happened in the laboratory is, there's no explanation at all, because all of nature has no explanation. What I'm describing here is called the principle of sufficient reason. And it's a cornerstone of modern philosophy. It was articulated by Leibniz. And it's the idea that you really have to acknowledge that in nature, there has to be an adaptation for everything that goes on in nature, or you really get to this epistemological morass where you have no reason to to do science, to explore things, because hey, maybe things just happen, right?
So
But we
the
don't
principle of
accept that.
sufficient reason. So the principle of sufficient reason is self-defeating, and it applies to a God equally as much as it would apply to any naturalistic hypotheses, which is why the vast majority of philosophers reject it. It's kind of worthless. So if God is uncreated, then everything you just said, or if God doesn't have a cause to himself, then everything you just said applies to a God, and we could just say, oh, why should we do science? Because that could have just been a miracle by God. The same argument applies to both hypotheses. This is not really a serious argument that refutes my position at all. My position is still the better explanation, that there is a thing we have evidence for and it's the necessary thing, is always better than there's a thing we have no evidence for and it's the necessary thing.
Well, as I said, I've been fascinated by this notion that people blindly accept the idea that this enormous, elegant, beautiful universe needs no explanation whatsoever. And then people passionately devote their lives to finding explanations within it. I mean, I do believe in looking for explanations, but I believe in that in part because I think that you do need an explanation for nature, and that it's a really unscientific and kind of intellectually sterile way to look at the world, to say, yeah, the whole shebang, no explanation, it's just here. Let's not ask any more questions about it. It strikes me as a bizarre metaphysical perspective.
And you don't see that you're doing the you're doing the exact same thing with God. You're saying, oh, here's this God who doesn't have an explanation, let's still do science.
God it no. Oh, no. We never know directly anything about God. I mean, this is a very old concept in theology. Everything we know about God is by analogy. We're not creatures who are capable of directly knowing God. We are capable of directly knowing, in a sense, nature. So God is outside of nature, and God can't be explained using the facilities that nature can be. And when you look at nature, it cries out for an explanation that transcends nature. It cries out for an explanation of, where did the Big Bang come from? Why is there anything? All these fundamental questions that people have. And to me, atheists and materialists really just jettison intellectual rigor by just saying, that's all there is. Let's go on for something. Let's just ignore that and go on to something else. The universe needs explanations.
And you don't see why atheists say you're doing the same thing. You're jettisoning all logic, saying, oh, God doesn't need an explanation. We're just going to just not ask the question about God.
Right. Well, I was an atheist for 45 years, so I kind of have a sense of what atheists think. And I didn't really think much about this because as an atheist, I didn't really understand very much. I didn't know about these arguments. God is outside of nature. He is outside of the realm that requires explanations. He is the explanation. He is God. God is, as St. Thomas would say, he is the entity in which existence is essence. That is, he is the fundamental existence. He doesn't require an explanation. He is explanations. But nature itself is not like that. Nature is not God.
So I can just say the exact same thing about nature. I can say nature is outside of the realm that needs explanations, or the quantum field is. So why do you think that your assertion is somehow more supported than my assertion?
Because there's nothing about a quantum field that would lead you to believe that it's the kind of thing that doesn't need an explanation. Whereas there's something about God, that God is transcendent. He's beyond the realm of human experience or of human perception.
So you've made up a property, ascribed it to a God.
Side of nature.
So you've made up a new property that there's no evidence for. You've ascribed this new property to a God and said, because it has this new property that has no evidence, therefore we can assert that it's doesn't need a cause. But it seems like I can do the same thing. I can make up a new property called the spaghetti property. The spaghetti property is a magical property that makes things no longer need an explanation. I'm going to say that the spaghetti property is in the universe, the spaghetti monster. Therefore, the universe doesn't need an explanation. So it seems like we can both make up a new property that has no evidence, ascribe it to a thing, a theory, and then say, we've won.
Amplitude-hedron, I think it's called.
Yeah, right. Exactly. This notion that you need evidence for God, or that there is no evidence for God, is profoundly misleading. That is, that there's a ton of evidence for God. In Aquinas' fifth way, in teleology, and final cause in nature, that nature demonstrates. Where does that goal directedness come from?
Emergent property. But I was just going with just this new property you're saying of transcendence. Like, there's no evidence of this property alone. No, there's no evidence of any other properties either. But this property alone, there's no evidence of. It just seems like something people have made up.
No, the Aquinas' first way is evidence for it. It's very clear evidence that there must be a prime mover. There must be something that initiates an essential chain of causal relationships. There must be a hand that moves the sticks, and you can't simply multiply the number of sticks and explain how it can move the rock. There has to be a prime mover. That's very, very clear evidence. It's a very clear chain of logic, and it's been around for 2,300 years, and it's never been refuted.
Right, it was refuted like the day it was made, essentially. So one, there's no logical contradiction with an infinite past regress. That's one way to solve it. Second is, we can just grant there is a necessary first mover, and it's not God, it's the quantum field.
Well, and a very important thing is to understand the difference between essential causal changes and accidental causal changes. Do you difference?
Do I know the difference? Well, I know Aquinas made up an arbitrary titles there,
Between,
but they don't actually
no,
correspond
no,
to
no,
reality.
no, 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 no. There are essential causal chains, and there are accidental causal chains. What's the difference?
Well, again, so in my worldview, they don't have any fundamental difference. So there aren't any. It's just Aquinas has made up definitions that don't have any fundamental difference. It's a difference,
And
distinction
essential
without
causal.
difference.
No, it's a very clear difference. Essential causal chains are causal chains in which each member of the causal chain has to still be existing for the causal chain to exert its effect. Accidental causal chains are causal chains where prior members can go out of existence, but the chain continues. An example of an accidental causal chain is a father begetting a son. The father was begat by a grandfather, who was begat by a great-grandfather. Each agent in that causal series can go out of existence after they've done their job, and the causal series still goes on. That causal series, which is an accidental causal series, is not what the prime mover argument is based on. The prime mover argument is based on an essential causal series. An example of an essential causal series is a stack of books. If you imagine a stack of books going as high and as low as you want, infinity if you want, and the changes say that one of the books shifts up or down in this stack. In order for that to happen, there has to be something from outside the stack that removes one of the books to shift the stack. The stack can't shift by itself. And that basically is the argument of the prime mover argument, that we have an essential cause, an essential series of causes, all of which have to simultaneously exist for the effect to occur, and they can't get themselves moving. If there's going to be, if something's going to cause a change in this series, it has to be something from outside the series. And as I said, it's a very old argument. It's never been refuted.
Well, I literally just refuted it the first time I responded. Like, anything whatever the prime mover could be anything and not a god. Like, it could be the quantum field, it could be a potato, it could be a pineapple, it could be there's lots of different things that this prime mover could be that don't entail a god, like the quantum field.
Right. Then what caused the quantum field?
What caused God?
What caused the quantum field? That's my question.
What caused God? The answer is the same for both. If you want to make up a new category,
it is in the nature of God that he is uncaused.
It is in the nature of the quantum field that it's uncaused.
Why do you say that? What would make you think a quantum?
Because I made it up the same way you did. I just made up a new property, ascribed it to the made up thing, just like you did.
Okay. So in your view, the argument to God's existence has the same logical force as the argument that the most fundamental thing is the quantum field.
Well, mine would be better, but yes.
Right. So you don't believe in God, so you don't believe in quantum fields either.
Well, I don't believe this argument is something that I would use to justify quantum fields. I think this argument is a silly argument that doesn't indicate anything. I think there's better arguments for quantum fields, like physics.
Yeah, and then there's excellent arguments for God, which is natural theology. I mean, there's a whole discipline devoted to that.
I believe I've refuted literally every single one of them in my career.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. What would be actually nice is now to get into the neuroscience of mind-brain stuff. I think we've been in quantum stuff and Big Bang long enough. On the neuroscience of the mind-brain relationship, one of the experiments that impressed me a great deal and still does is the work of Wilder Penfield, who's the pioneer in epilepsy neurosurgery. He worked back in the mid-20th century in Montreal. And he made an observation that fascinates me, and that is that there are no intellectual seizures. And what he pointed out was when you look at the probably 250 million seizures that people have had in modern times, when modern science has been available to evaluate seizures, there's never been a report of a seizure that involved intellectual content. By intellectual content, I mean abstract thought. People don't have calculus seizures. People don't have seizures where they contemplate quantum fields or quantum mechanics or philosophy. Seizures always involve one of several things, either motor movement like shaking, sensations, emotions, and seizures can give you emotions, or memories, but they don't involve abstract thought. And Penfield came to the conclusion then that abstract thought must not be something that's generated by the brain, because if it were something that was generated by the brain, out of 250 million seizures which are generated in the brain, we ought to have at least occasionally had a seizure that manifested as abstract thought. He then tried experimentally doing surgery, stimulating the brains of patients who were awake during the surgery, which is something that we do to map the surface of the brain. And he noticed in hundreds of thousands of stimulations in over 1,000 patients, he was never able, even once, to generate abstract thought by stimulating the brain. So I consider that reasonably solid neuroscientific evidence that abstract thought does not arise from the brain, or certainly doesn't arise from the brain in the same way that other kinds of mental states do.
Okay, so the two things you brought up there is, one, that seizures don't cause intellectual thought. Well, that seems really easy to explain, because intellectual thought is a complex process in the brain that requires a specific ordering of the neurological signals. And so if there's a random ordering of neurological signals in a thing with 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections, the probability that it's going to actually hit the correct combination of things and none of the other things to produce a abstract thought is extremely low. So is it possible? Yes, it would be possible that a seizure could do this. Is it likely? No, unless the seizure is extremely, extremely small and precise. And so a typical seizure, which causes lots of electrical signals in the brain, is very unlikely to produce something that would be required to have a very small, precise outcome. It's like, if I have a typewriter and I just smash on the typewriter, it's highly unlikely that I'm going to produce the word "the," because I'm hitting much more keys than 3. Like, in order to produce a 3 words or a word with 3 letters, I'd have to hit 3 keys. If I'm hitting 1,000 keys, I'm obviously highly unlikely going to just produce a word with 3 letters. So because thought requires a very precise, small number of letters in a precise order with no other letters being smashed at the same time, it's unlikely going to happen that you're going to get that with the seizure. What was the second thing? Was abstract thought?
Well, yeah, but let's go back to that. That's an interesting question. Seizures can involve very complex activities. There's a kind of a seizure called partial complex seizures that can involve very complex mental states, emotional states, memories. It can involve walking around, doing things, operating machinery, things like that, all sorts of complex things. Abstract thought is not necessarily complex. For example, I can think of 1 + 1 = 2. It's not a terribly complex thing. It's a lot less complex than walking around and opening doors or driving cars and things like that. Seizures can be things that's a definite type of seizure. There are many abstract thoughts that are really quite simple. The seizures never evoke them. It's really, it warrants an explanation. And if all thought comes from the brain, if including abstract thought, you have to explain what's never evoke it. They evoke everything else. Every other kind of mental state is evoked by seizures.
For the reason I explained previously, like abstract thought, I agree, is very simple. But it's very precise. So it's like the word "the" on a keyboard. You have to type out T-H-E and then stop. If you're typing
Seizures,
boom, 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 you're not going to get a precise little small
walking
thing.
Walking is very precise. Many
Walking
people
involves
have seizures.
Walking involves tens of millions of neurons. It is not a simple little THE. It is lots and lots of stuff going on in the brain at the same time.
How many neurons are involved in abstract thought?
Probably a lot less than walking.
How do you know that?
Because if we damage certain areas of the brain that stop the ability for abstract thought, takes a lot less to do that than for walking. Like there's less space in the brain that you have to destroy.
I've spent my career working on brains, and I damaging certain areas of the brain in any reliable, consistent way interferes with abstract thought is just not the way it works. I've taken out major parts of frontal lobes in people who I was talking to while I was doing it, because the surgery is done with local anesthesia and awake surgery, so I can map the frontal lobe. And there's no interference with abstract thought at all. I have patients who are missing 2/3 of their brain and still have just fine abstract thought. So there's a big difference between abstract thought and other kinds of neurological things. And that led me to Thomistic dualism, because that actually is predicted by Aristotle's and St. Thomas's model of the mind.
So aphantasia, the inability to voluntarily create mental images.
Would be, I'm sorry?
Aphantasia, the inability to voluntarily create mental images to do abstract thought. So we do know conditions that can do this, that can cause this.
You're misunderstanding abstract thought. Abstract thought is not mental images. Mental images.
Yes, it is. That's literally what abstract thought is. Abstract thought is literally a mental image.
Okay. No, it's not. The abstract thought is thought without images. It's concepts. Imagination is a different thing. An example of the difference. Ever heard of a chiliagon? Chiliagon is the name. Chilligon. Chiliagon is a 1,000-sided figure, so it's a closed plane figure with 1,000 sides. You can conceptualize what it is, but you can't form a mental image of what it is. There's a difference between a concept and forming a mental image. A concept.
What about the mental image of the amplitude hedron?
Oh yes, a very interesting mental image. So there are all sorts of concepts that don't have mental images.
No, those are all mental images. So those are literally just combining different mental images into the same thing, which you can't process at the same time. That's all mental imagery. Those are all
the amplitude hedron is outside time and space. So how do you have a mental image of that one? This amplitude hedron going after it.
It's how the brain processes information and comes up with ideas. Like, how do you have a unicorn with a cow's head on it? Well, you imagine a cow's head and you imagine a horse's body and you put them together. The same thing applies to an object with 1,000 sides. Like, obviously you can only imagine like an object with 10 sides before your brain is unable to like process more sides, but you can abstract the rest by using a different mental image, like saying, there's more there.
What's your mental image of infinity?
It's a bunch of dots that keeps going past where I can't see them anymore.
No, that's just dots that end somewhere. I'm talking about infinity.
Yeah, that's the same thing. So the concept of infinity is taking
infinity is a concept of which you cannot form a mental image.
So all concepts are just different combinations of mental images. That's all they are. You're just combining different concepts of mental images.
So to have a concept of infinite numbers of mental images, That's quite a bit of creativity there.
You have a series like dots, dot, 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 and then you imagine and you take the concept of it continuing, and you take those two concepts, you put them together, and that's how you get infinity, and you label it with infinity.
In that case, you have dots, and the dots end somewhere, and that's not infinity. Infinity doesn't have an end. So,
so you
no,
take two concepts.
My point is, and this is rudimentary philosophy, that abstract thought, that, for example, infinity is an abstract thought, and you can't put it in a physical substrate. That's what an abstract thought is something that doesn't have a physical substrate. It doesn't mean that you can't attach images to it to help you grasp it, but the concept of infinity is not an image. It's not imagination.
Literally is. So literally every single concept in the mind is a combination of images and things we've seen. That's every single one of them. There are no exceptions. So infinity, the concept of infinity, is a result of two different mental images. One is a series, and two is it continuing and not stopping. Those two concepts, when you put together, we labeled that with an idea called infinity. And that infinity, the reason it's an abstract is because it can apply to lots of different kinds of things, not just the one particular thing we're imagining.
All right. You are flailing, Tom. You're flailing, all right? Infinity is not something that can be in a mental image because it's not finite, right? That's what infinity means, not finite. So that's my point, is that abstract things are different from images.
So I don't think you understand how ambiguity works in a brain. So this is extremely simple in both psychology and neurology. So I think you're just very confused on this topic. This is really simple.
It's working a lot.
Let me to finish. Let me to finish my point before you. So we know how ambiguity works, that you can come up with ideas and representations that aren't specific enough to refer to a single thing. So like it's an ambiguity in the mind. If you're imagining something but you can't quite picture it, it could apply to lots of different things, because in your brain, stimulation can stimulate lots of different things and not just one thing. That's how it works. And so if you have these kinds of ambiguous conceptions in your mind that can apply to multiple things, you have to label that ambiguity with something, which is abstractions. So none of this is complicated. This is why no one in neurology, or essentially the vast majority, the consensus, rejects anything you just said there, because it's just not how the brain works. There's no evidence to support that. You're just kind of just asserting that there's this concept that can't be represented in physical brains. Like, no, there's no evidence of that. None whatsoever. That's why the consensus is against you.
Amplitude hedron. Yeah.
Represented by Josh's hair.
The fact is that we have tons and tons of concepts that cannot be physically that cannot be physical images, and our ability to conceptualize is not a physical ability, and that actually is the part of the mind that is not material. That the other parts of the mind, perception, sensation, emotion, memory, have a pretty solid material basis. The ability to conceptualize abstract thoughts does not have a material basis, and Aristotle knew that, and that's made very, very clear by the neuroscience.
Aristotle knew the neuroscience. Like, no, so like everything that's just false. Like, yeah, we can disable abstract thought in the brain by disabling like emotions and other parts, the visual parts. Like, yeah, you stop losing the ability to abstract think when you lose the visual parts, and everything else is nope.
Okay. How about this? There's ever heard of Adrian Owen's work on persistent vegetative state?
Vaguely. I think in my debate
he
might have brought that up.
Yeah, he was a researcher who, or he is a researcher who works in Cambridge in England, and he studied persistent vegetative state. Persistent vegetative state is sort of the deepest level of coma. It is found in people who have massive brain damage, in which by ordinary neurological exam, there isn't any evidence for any mental activity whatsoever. These people are just totally out. So he asked a question. The problem in persistent vegetative state is that these people have tremendous disabilities. They're paralyzed, they're blind, they can't communicate readily. And he asked, is there really no evidence for any mental activity in these people? So what he did was he took first one woman and then did it with many other patients who was in persistent vegetative state by the traditional diagnosis. She was in a car accident and for a number of years had shown no evidence of mental activity. put her in a functional MRI machine that can detect changes in blood flow in the brain that seem to correspond with brain activity. And he asked her questions. He said, conceptualize various things, conceptualize walking across a room, or conceptualize playing tennis and things like that. And she, and he found that there were patterns of activation in her brain that responded to the questions. So what he asked the question, is she really conceptualizing what I'm asking her to conceptualize? So he took normal volunteers and asked them the same questions, and they had actually the same pattern. So then he jumbled the words, so the words made no sense in a pattern, both her and the volunteers. So we concluded that she was capable actually of abstract thought, even in persistent vegetative state. And his research has been repeated by a number of people. And what it shows is that there's an enormous disconnect between the capacity for abstract thought and the functioning of the brain. You can have massive brain damage where you're so badly damaged, you're blind, you're paralyzed, you can't speak, you can't do anything, but you appear to still be capable of abstract thought, at least in some circumstances. That disconnect I find fascinating, and again, I believe supports dualism.
Well, that's not evidence you have abstract thought. That's evidence that the neurons and blood flow in the brain is activating the same areas that what you're abstractly thinking would be activated, but that doesn't show in any way that those are actually being formed into a thought.
Well, what it does show, well, first of all, he compared it to normal volunteers where you can actually, if they're thinking or not. And by comparing it to the normal volunteers, she had exactly the same responses. When he took the words that he used and jumbled them so they semantically made no sense, she stopped responding. So it wasn't just a response to noise, it was a response to the semantic contents of the words, which implies that she did understand.
No.
It's fascinating research.
That doesn't imply that she understood. That implies that the words caused a neurological response in the brain that has the neuroplastic connections that are associated with the patterns in the words. Does that mean that that pattern is then being sent to a conscious experience? No. Like the same thing applies to near-death experience when you're completely non-conscious at all, and you still have verbal sensations or physical sensations that are sent to the brain through your senses. That information is then converted into a memory that you experience as a present memory when you wake up, but you didn't experience it while you were in the near-death experience.
Right.
It was just saved in your brain as a memory that was then saved to a conscious memory.
Right.
And so it's the same thing, is that the brain is still
Right.
functioning to make the same connections that used to be there that you learned in the past because of the neuroplastic connections that developed in the past. That doesn't mean that that neuroplastic stimulation is actually being sent to a conscious experience.
Right, because you can't experience it directly. All of our knowledge of other people's mental states are behavioral of sorts. You have to look at what they're doing, either what their brain is doing or what their body is doing. But this strongly implies that it is. And the notion that this, as you say, the neuroplastic, whatever, of recognizing normal semantics, this is a woman with massive brain damage, so massive that she showed no signs on ordinary examination of having any mental states whatsoever. And in fact, she was able to have very complex mental states. And this has been shown in about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state who have been studied in this fashion. They show the capacity for abstract thought. Some people can even do mathematics.
Question for you. So if we opened their eyes and shined a flashlight in their eye and we saw brain activity in the visual center, does that mean that the people in the vegetative state are actually seeing the light, or does that just mean that their visual centers are responding to the photons?
That's a very good question. I think it is entirely reasonable to infer if you see brain activity associated with light being shined in someone's eyes, that they are in some sense perceiving it.
I definitely would disagree, given the fact that we can cause all kinds of brain experiences that people don't experience. For example, there's many studies that of the one where there's someone's blind in one eye, and you like show them a color or something and in the blind eye, and their brain responds to it even though they can't see it, they have no recollection of it. So there's obviously sensations that you can cause that people are just completely oblivious of.
What you're describing is blind sight. in blind sight is a very well recognized phenomenon where people who are blind are still able, or at least cortically blind, are still able to maneuver around objects in their environment, and that does happen. It's very well documented, and these people are still aware of the objects. But they are aware of the objects in a different sense than ordinarily. That is, if you ask them, "Can you see it?" they say no, but their behavior manifests the reality that they can see it. But it's a preconscious awareness. So there is an awareness. They walk around things. It's just not an awareness that's fully conscious.
Right. So if we presume abstract thought is conscious, I would assume that. But if it's purely subconscious and there's no conscious experience of it whatsoever, and it's purely just a product of the brain doing its thing, then you can have those patterns seen in the brain without it ever being conscious thought or abstract thought. There's no thought going on. It's just a response from the brain, just like how I interpret blind sight or people reacting to things. Like if you throw a ball at them, they dodge. They have no idea why.
Yeah, but
it's just their brain
right.
responding.
Right. But again, that implies that the only kind of awareness we can have is an immediate awareness of a fully conscious sort. And we have a lot of awareness that's not fully conscious, all sorts of awareness that's not fully conscious. We're aware of all sorts of things that guide our everyday life that we don't think about constantly. If you had to be aware of everything you were doing all the time, you could never function because you're doing too many things at once.
Right. So my argument here is that the part of your brain that isn't conscious can do logic, abstract thought, like there's logic gates in neurons that work just fine. And so these patterns that we're seeing doesn't imply that actual abstract thought or thinking or conscious experience is going on. This can all be done without conscious experience.
Right. Would you say, for example, that in our conversation here that that you wouldn't necessarily infer consciousness in me, or I need not infer it in you? I mean,
it's not a necessity, obviously.
So you're saying behavioral responses aren't necessarily or aren't reasonable guides to whether or not there's consciousness.
They can be reasonable guides in many cases. They are not necessarily guides.
So why aren't hers? And what Owen showed was that when you look at the brain changes on functional MRI imaging, that the patterns of response between her and people who were fully normally conscious were about the same. They're really the same patterns.
In hers, it could go either way, but because we don't have the external way of verifying by asking, like, are you conscious? And she can't say, yes, I'm conscious. It's not a strong correlation there. Right there, we don't know. Is it just subconscious brain firings through neuroplasticity and there's no consciousness, or is there consciousness? It's not evidence one way or the other. We don't know.
Right.
So it would be wrong to use that as evidence to indicate that there is something else going on. Like even if it happened, that still wouldn't be evidence that there's dualism.
First of all, it's obvious evidence of something else going on. The fact that you can have somebody with massive brain damage, just short of brain death, who is capable, or who shows on functional MRI imaging patterns suggestive of complex abstract thought. Yeah, that's something. That's really evidence of something going on. Now, you really have to have an ideological commitment to materialism to deny the remarkable evidence that Owen provided.
So if I take a vase and throw it against a wall and break it and find that there's a piece of the vase that still has the pattern on it, does that mean that the vase is non-physical? Well, no. It just means that that part of the vase didn't get broken. So obviously, if there's somebody who has severe brain damage and enough of their brain is damaged that they can no longer function, that doesn't mean that literally every neurological connection has been broken. So you can still find patterns in their brain that would still work as if it was unbroken.
Right. You argued before that abstract thought was very precise, and that it was that the reason that no seizure has ever evoked abstract thought, or that Penfield couldn't evoke it by stimulating the brain, was that it was too precise to stimulate. Right. Now you're saying that it is the opposite of that it is not not precise, and that even people with massive brain damage can still show evidence for it, can still show brain patterns. Are those brain patterns precise or not?
It's precise. So by precise, I mean a small specific combination of the neurons. So not many, a small amount of neurons in this specific
order. So you say
produces.
It's a small amount of, what's your evidence that abstract thought comes from only a small amount of neurons? What's
by comparing the amount of brain activity when doing abstract thought to other things like walking.
I'm not aware of that neuroscience. So walking takes fewer neurons than or more neurons.
Walking takes more. So physical activity, doing things in the world takes more than abstract thought. Abstract thought takes less generally. So like thinking of 1 + 1 = 2 causes your brain to activate less blood flow than like running, jogging, boxing, whatever.
Yeah,
so
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, there are various patterns of fMRI activation seen with doing various kinds of neurological things. I'm not aware of that particular distinction.
Okay.
If you have the reference, I'd love to see it.
Sure, I'd probably find that sometime. The point here is that you said there was a contradiction in my uses of the terms. There is not. So I'm saying that the ability to do abstract thought takes a few thousand neurons, probably, that I would guess. And so if you have severe, as opposed to a few 100 million or a few tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands. So just to clarify my position here. So if you have severe brain damage will not affect every clump of 10,000 neurons in the brain. It will affect large clumps. Like if you throw a vase against a wall, it will break into many pieces, but the vast majority of the vase did not break. The vast majority of the vase is still held together in the same atomic structure it was when the vase was put together. There are just cracks going through very particular small regions of it. Like I think 1% of a vase actually separates. 1% of the physical connections in a vase will separate if you throw it against a wall. The same thing happens with brain damage. About 1% or 10% maybe of all of the connections in the brain are destroyed from severe brain damage. That means that 90% are still going to have the working connections that were there before. And so you can find all of those connections if you activate them in the correct way and say, oh, these work exactly the same as they did with a live person.
Where do you get all this from? What makes you think that only 10% are destroyed?
Well, obviously, like if you burn the brain, then it would depend on the amount of the method. It would depend on the method of damaging the brain, but you can. The amount of damage caused to cause brain death is not 90% of brain damage. You can cause brain death with 1%. You can just damage the part that connects your brain to your spinal column, and you cause brain death.
No.
So it does not. The qualification for brain death does not require a significant amount of brain damage.
What I don't think you understand brain death. What do you think brain death is? We're not talking about brain death here. This has nothing to do with brain death. What do you think brain death is?
Pretty much the stopping of oxygen to the brain to some degree, something like that. But whatever you mentioned earlier.
Brain death, no. Persistent vegetative state is not brain death. Brain death is biological death of all of the brain. So
I used the wrong technical term. That's fine. So the vegetative state, to cause a vegetative state, does not require damaging a significant portion of the brain. You can damage a small portion of the brain to cause that effect. Correct.
What's a typical brain weight of a person compared to normal of a person in persistent vegetative state?
I have no idea.
It's about half.
Okay. Does that damage the connections, or is that just less water?
No, there's plenty of water. The water in the head doesn't change. The skull is rigid. It's full of brain and water.
The weight does not imply the connections are damaged. That is not evidence to your position.
Well, the weight implies that there's a loss of mass in the brain. And the brain, so unless you're claiming that this is a dehydrated brain, which you don't have any evidence for, a loss of neurons, axons, dendrites, all that kind of stuff. The point is that in persistent vegetative damage is generally massive and pervasive. And, the argument that I'm making here is that when you put these different lines of reason together, the failure of seizures to evoke abstract thought, the failure of the ability to evoke abstract thought using stimulation of the brain. Again, with seizures, we're talking about 250 million seizures in the modern era, hundreds of thousands at least of stimulations of the brain intraoperatively, as well as cases like Owen's work with persistent vegetative state. Abstract thought is not linked to the brain in the same tight way that other kinds of thought are, or other kinds of mental states are, which supports a dualist perspective, which actually is just the perspective that St. Thomas and Aquinas took, that abstract thought is different and is not material.
So again, the first thing of just saying that epilepsy, which is just a random electrical firing in the brain, doesn't produce a very specific idea in the brain, is like saying sticking a fork in an electrical socket doesn't produce a picture of the Mona Lisa or just any simple image. Like, yeah, you can do that if you give them enough time, enough chances, but the probability is extremely low.
Epilepsy produces memories. You can easily produce memories. It can, which can be very complex. It can produce sensations which are quite complex. It can produce, it make people walk, make people behave.
Yep.
But it never
so
makes
that's easy to
anybody
explain.
do 1 + 1. It never makes anyone.
That's
do
really
1
easy
+
to
1.
explain. Epilepsy can cause the things that you do very often, which due to neuroplasticity are the connections in the brain that are the most developed and the easiest to continuously stimulate. And it doesn't cause things that people do very rarely, like math, like just doing abstract thought in their head, because those parts of your brain aren't as developed as the parts of walking or memories.
Yeah, I mean, but that's all special pleading. I mean, the fact is you've got 250 million seizures and not a single abstract thought. A reasonable person would come away from that saying, well, maybe the brain isn't the actual source of abstract thought if you can't evoke it by a seizure.
Can you remember the last time you thought of the equation 4 + 4 = 8? When was the last time you thought of that equation?
I mean, I actually think of it quite a bit because I do math in my research, so I think of stuff like that. I mean, that particular, but any kind of math. I mean, I think of math a lot, all the time,
No, like
as most people do, just in their daily life. Well, that's specific.
So I mean,
one,
like,
yeah, but people think of math when they do money, when they do their checkbook, when they when they tune the radio. I mean, people think of numbers and math constantly, but that's not the only example. I mean, any kind of abstract thought, thinking about justice or mercy, philosophy, all kinds of that. I mean, the abstract thought has enormous range of objects. People never think of that.
Well, epileptics have seizures and see God. Like, that's abstract thought.
Well, people can have images in their mind, and they can have emotions. We're talking about concepts, which are different, and concepts are not evoked by epilepsy.
Those are remember, concepts are the same thing here. So if you see God and you have a feeling of God, that's abstract thought.
No, they're not the same thing.
If you think you met God, that's abstract thought. So you've made something up.
Images, no, because if you have this image in your mind of some guy with a white beard and a toga, and you ran into him, that's not the same thing as a concept. The concepts are different from images. Here's a very good example: is triangles. Think about triangles. Conceptually, a triangle is a plane figure that's closed with 3 straight sides, internal angles summed to 180 degrees. But we can never form an image of a perfect triangle. Any mental image we have is going to be imperfect in some sense. There are no perfect triangles in the real world. But we can make a concept of a perfect triangle very easily. Therefore, the image and the concept are not the same thing.
So yeah, I'm not seeing your distinction here. If someone sees like a big bright light and has a feeling and said, "I saw God," there during an epileptic seizure, that seems
yeah. Well, if someone sees a bright light and then after the seizure says, I think that was probably God. Okay, but that's a concept formed after the seizure. What I'm
Right,
talking.
but
Let's,
remember what I said earlier is
you're-
that people can have things saved to their brain as a past experience that they didn't consciously label. So it was labeled as God in their brain subconsciously, and they remembered it as God.
yeah,
The brain can do that
This is
just fine.
this is sort of a rabbit hole. Your basic argument is that concepts and precepts, or concepts and images, same things. That concepts are basically collections of images. And
Yep.
I've just given you an example of a triangle in which a concept of a triangle cannot be an image, because there are no perfect triangles in images, but there are perfect triangles in concepts.
So again, the concept is of the general shape, and then we add another concept of specific measurements, and those two concepts give you triangle. So triangle is literally an image. It's a mental image.
No, an image is in this context is something visible, and there's no visible line that's perfectly straight. There's
It doesn't need to be.
sum of internal angles. Yes, it does, because the concept of a
Nope.
triangle is three.
I think you just don't understand how concepts work.
Oh, I know. I understand very well.
You don't need an image of a perfect triangle to have an image of a triangle and then an image of perfection and combine the two to have a thing that would fit that label. Like, you don't need an image of a perfect triangle to have an image of a perfect triangle. Exactly.
No,
like, you don't need this.
No. You can understand what a triangle is without any images at all. I could, for example, well, you can have concepts that don't involve images. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't make images from the concept. That is, that you can have a concept of a perfect triangle and this little thing floating in your mind of a little triangle. But that little triangle in your mind is not perfect, whereas your concept is perfect.
So all of your concepts are just combinations of different images and ideas in your head, nothing more. There's combinations of your experiences and different relations between those experiences.
Right.
That's it.
What is the image that gives you the concept of the square root of -1?
It's simply is a mathematical relation. So you have an image of 1, an image of a square root, and you put the two together. Now you have an image of the square root of -1, and you have these ideas
and that's the whole concept.
There's lots of different parts to it because math is very complex, but each of the different individual parts are things that were built up from other combinations of images starting with 1.
Right.
So all of math is just added concepts, added images.
Well, images certainly play a role in learning math. There's no question about that. But the concept of the square root of -1 doesn't depend upon the written number -1 and the written square root sign. Those aren't that's not essential for the concept.
Right. That's just how we came up with them and learned them and defined them.
Concept used to express it.
That's how we came up with it. Yes,
but it's not them. It's not the same thing. It's
right.
not. It's
right,
not
because they don't actually exist.
People generally learn math through images, but what they learn is not an image. What they learn is a concept. It's different from an image.
The only reason that concept exists in their brain is as an image and a relation with the image. The only reason it's in the abstract concept itself isn't in their brain. They have an image, a particular image, which they give a definition.
Well, all concepts, all mental content, according to St. Thomas, and I totally agree with this, originally comes from images of sorts. That is, that we aren't born with any inherent concepts. Everything comes in through our senses, but we extract concepts from images, and the concepts have an existence that is independent of the images. So I can understand the square root of -1 without having an image of a 1 and a negative and a square root sign. I don't need that image to understand this. I can work with complex numbers without thinking of that image.
That's still an image. If you're working with complex numbers, that's an image.
So what's the image of logic, of, say, modus tollens? Do you need an image to understand modus tollens?
Yep. You start with a particular and then you ambiguate it. So you have dogs are mammals are animals, therefore dogs are animals. And then you take those and you ambiguate them and then you get logic. So you take a particular, ambiguate it, you get an abstract.
Right. So you take the logic out of it, essentially. You draw the logic out of it.
You sort of, you take the particular and you ambiguate it to get logic. So logic is
Correct.
an ambiguation.
Correct.
So you start with the particular image.
So it's
You start
not
with
the
the
same
image.
thing as the image. Well, what you're saying is exactly what Aristotle said, that you take the particular and you draw out of it the universal. And the universal is not the same thing as the particular. If it were, you couldn't draw it out of it.
So the mental image of logic is any particular, which you make it really fuzzy. Like if you take off your glasses, then you get logic. That's it. You're taking off the glasses of the image. There's still a particular image there in your head somewhere. It's just, you just can't see it clearly. So it's ambiguous.
Yeah. Again, this gets to some degree the difference between universals and particulars, and the question of realism versus nominalism. But I think there is no doubt that conceptual thought is of a fundamentally ontologically different nature than perception. They're different things. You can draw concepts out of perceptions, and you can generate perceptions from concepts, but they're different. They're not the same thing. The concept of the imaginary number is a different thing from the written square root of -1 on a piece of paper. A very good example would be that you can write the square root of -1 in a whole bunch of ways: big, small, green ink, red ink, blue ink, but the concept's still the same.
So I agree with the consensus in philosophy and neurology that I'm a nominalist and that theirs are just physical things.
Yeah. Recourse to feigned impression. You have to make your arguments.
All of the evidence indicates you're wrong. Like there's no novel predictions that are indicated by anything you said. It's all just you're hypothesizing and nothing more. So there is no evidence to support what you said. All of the evidence indicates materialism. All of it indicates.
Let's try this novel prediction. I predict that you can't form a coherent, precise mental image of a 1,000-sided closed figure, but that you can understand what a 1,000-sided closed figure is very easily.
Well, one, that's not a prediction, and two, ambiguity works.
I predict it. I made the prediction. Is it true, or are you the only person on Earth who can form a mental image of a 1,000-sided figure?
A prediction is something you have to make a prediction about something we don't know yet.
Sure.
And as I said earlier, a mental image is an ambiguity. So you take an object with 6 sides, you ambiguate it, and poof, you've imagined an object with 1,000 sides. None of this is hard. None of this is controversial in neurology. None of this is spectacular.
Okay. All right. Can you form a mental image of, say, 4 dimensions, or of 10 dimensions, or 20?
Tesseract. Yes, I can imagine a 3-dimensional object and ambiguate it. Yes, done. Just
no. Ambiguated is what I say happens.
That's what mental imagery is. That's literally what it is. That's all you need to do to imagine all of these things. There's no special object there that exists outside of your ambiguated imagination. That's all it is. That's all you need.
No. The making it ambiguous is the process of extracting the conceptual content in it. That's what ambiguation means, is that you take the conceptual content out of it.
No, it doesn't. All it means is that you're connecting it to other concepts. You're taking multiple concepts and combining them together to make it not a specific concept. That's what ambiguation is. None of this is hard. This is all really well understood.
So mathematicians routinely work with multidimensional spaces. It's a very common thing in mathematics.
Yes.
And how is that imagined as opposed to conceptualized? How do you imagine a multidimensional
Imagined and
space?
conceptual are synonyms, so they're the same thing. What they do is they take multiple different concepts, the concepts of 3 dimensions and a different concept of time, add that together, and you get 4 dimensions. So they're multiple concepts that are combined together.
Okay. So you've just mentioned time as a concept. What's the imagination form of time? That is that time, if you're correct, and concepts are really just images. How do you get time out of images? How do you understand time?
Well, there's multiple versions, but the Einstein space-time is actually a
Say
physical thing
clocks.
that exists. It's just a
Okay.
wave, kind of like a wave in the universe, like a field, like electromagnetism or magnetic field. It's space-time is a field,
Yeah.
like all the other
Yeah.
fields.
Concepts can be drawn out of images. In fact, that's the way they usually are formed, is by drawing them out of images. But the fact that they can be
Yeah.
drawn out means they are not images. They are concepts. They're separate.
Again, I think you're just confused about how concepts work. Like I've explained this to you multiple times. Everybody in the audience should get it. This is not difficult. Like space-time is literally things we draw, and it's a concept that created by human minds. There's no actually existing abstraction outside of our brains.
Right.
It doesn't exist.
Just repeating your misunderstanding doesn't make it true.
Repeating my answer to your question that fully explains it
is something. A very good example we discussed before is infinity, which is something that conceptually we all understand quite easily. It's not difficult to conceptualize. To form images is not possible. You can't have an image of anything infinite.
Those are literally synonymous. If you conceptualize it, you have an image of it. If you have an image of it, you've conceptualized it.
As I said, they're not synonymous because they're two different things, and that's what you're describing is two different things. They frequently are done at the same time. We frequently have concepts that we form images from, or we have images from which we extract concepts, but images and concepts are different things.
Nope, they're not. So it's like imagining a billion. You obviously can't imagine a billion individual things, but you can combine different other concepts like 10 and then 100 tens or whatever, 110 millions, 100 millions, and get a billion. So you can conceptualize a billion without having to conceptualize each individual of the billion. The same thing applies to infinity. If you have two concepts like a continuous link that doesn't stop, you can conceptualize infinity.
Okay, getting back to the square root of -1. How do you get that concept?
Exact same way, by combining square roots and negatives and other concepts. You take multiple concepts, you combine them together, you have conceptualized it.
No.
Square root of -1 is a vector.
No.
The square root of -1 is a vector. It's a vector, which means it's just multi-directional. This is not hard to conceptualize.
No, it's not hard to conceptualize, but the concept is not the same thing as the image of the square root of -1.
I feel I've debunked you on this enough. I would like to move on to something else because I've crushed you on this topic as far as I'm concerned.
Right. It's generating a lot of images there, but not too many concepts. Well, let's see. What else do we have to talk about? We can talk about
free will. We haven't done free will
yet.
That's
a beautiful topic. So I take it that you don't believe in free will.
Yeah, as far as I know, free will is logically impossible. Everything we do is either determined for reasons or done for no reasons, in which case it's random and there's no third option. Therefore, you can't have free will because any decision you make is either going to be determined, which means it's not free, or it's going to be random, which means it's not free.
What determines, so let's say the free will of your expressing your opinion right now, like the last thing you said, that was presumably you freely chose to say that. What determines that?
Neurology.
Sure. Okay. So what do you mean? You mean like firing of your axons and stuff like that?
Yeah, most likely.
Okay. So why would your axonal firing warrant any kind of consideration in a debate? Meaning that
why does that have to do with free will? Whether or not
how can there be any truth in the firing of an axon?
That's not relevant to whether or not we have free will.
How can an axon? Oh, yes, it is, because if you don't have free will, then you're a chemistry set, basically. And how can a chemistry set? How can a chemistry set make a proposition that's capable of being true or false?
Well, a calculator can do it just fine, but that's irrelevant to whether or not we have free will. So asking, well, it's an appeal to consequences fallacy. What you just said is an appeal to consequences fallacy.
Right. I don't debate with chemistry sets. I debate with people, and people have free will. If you're a chemistry set, how does a chemistry set produce a proposition that's capable of being true or false?
Again, it's not relevant to whether or not we have free will. What you're doing is an appeal to consequence
Yes, it
fallacy.
is.
It's a red
Yes,
herring.
it is. Because free will is because denial of free will is self-refuting. If you
No,
say
it's
you don't
not.
have free will, if you say you don't have free will, then you are acknowledging that you're a chemistry set. Why would
Yes, and
anybody
that's
listen
perfectly
to what a
fine.
chemistry set?
If I'm a chemistry
So
set, I don't have free will, and I would be right. I would be right if I said I don't have free will, and I'm a chemistry set. So that doesn't disprove I don't have free will.
No, you may well be right, but why would anyone listen to a chemistry set? That is,
what does that have to do with whether or not we have free will? The question is, do we have free will? Not do you want to listen to me? I don't care if you want to listen to me. I want to know if I have free will.
No,
if I don't have free will, whether or not you want to listen to me is irrelevant.
No, the problem is if you are asserting that the motivation or the cause of your behavior is not freely chosen, but is the consequence of brain chemistry. I am saying that brain chemistry does not have propositional content. Therefore, it's not capable of asserting truth or denying truth. It's just chemistry. It's just secretions. So if what you're saying is you're basically a meat robot, and why would anyone listen to say?
Well, so those are two different questions. Your first argument is that non-free will based things cannot make propositions. Well, that
Correct.
seems
Absolutely
false. Now, that would be begging the question on your part. You're assuming, it's logically impossible for meat robots to ever have the emergent property of logic, which is just false. Like that's just begging the question. The second question was, well, why would anybody listen to you?
Kind of magic. Right, exactly. So what you're saying is that everything you say is determined by your current balance of neurotransmitters and maybe what you had for breakfast and what happened to you yesterday.
Sure.
So why would anybody particularly care about what you have to say if you're just this bunch of that's essentially a chemistry set?
That's just an appeal to motive fallacy. It doesn't matter.
When you deny free will, what you're saying is intellectual agency. That is the ability to choose what you think is right or wrong in a way that's not determined by simple physical processes. So the denial of free will is self-refuting in the sense that a person who denies free will undercuts any reason to listen to them, because then all I'm listening to is the static from your neurotransmitters.
So you can be determined to accept good reasons or something like that. Your brain is determined in such a way that if it's presented with a certain kind of evidence or rationality, then it will be compelled by that evidence and rationality. Therefore, there is a reason to debate in so that you are seeking these kinds of good evidence and rationality you haven't discovered yet. Therefore, it's perfectly reasonable to have debates with determined things, like it's perfectly reasonable to look up information on Wikipedia. Even though Wikipedia is determined, you can still find information there. So your appeal to motive fallacy of saying, well, why do you do this is completely incoherent. The reason debate is valuable is because we're determined to seek good information. So determination actually makes it reasonable to have debates.
What you're saying is,
but the first thing I wanted to talk about, the first thing. So firstly, you brought up the free will is self-refuting because the meat thingies can't produce intentionality propositions. So that's propositions. So that again seems to be just you begging the question. You can't understand how meat could do this, therefore it can't. You haven't presented any evidence that it's impossible for this to be emergent. You've just asserted it sort of. So it's not magic on my part. You are making the negative claim. Like if I claim it's impossible for there to be a God, you're essentially just doing that, saying it's impossible for meat to produce propositions. And so you would hold the burden of proof to show that's logically impossible, which you haven't done. I don't need magic here. I can just say it's possible, and my argument, my position is more supported.
What we understand is statements that are capable of being true or false. That is, that once you have truth content in a statement, that you're talking about something that transcends neurochemistry and neurobiology. There's something else going on there. It seems to be fairly self-evident. For example, why why, if free will doesn't exist, why are you trying to convince people that if people aren't free
Because
to
I'm
change their
determined to.
minds, why bother? Why bother to have a debate if everything is determined?
Because if they're determined to follow rationality and evidence, and you present them with rationality and evidence, then they're determined to change their position. That would be, so determination would actually make it reasonable to debate, because they're determined to change their position
So
under
you're
given conditions. So you want to present the given conditions to change their position.
So you're forcing them to. They don't freely choose it.
Yep. With the
Okay,
logic.
so anyone who agrees with you then is being forced to agree with you. They don't freely choose to agree with you.
Yep.
And I presume people who disagree with you are also being forced to disagree with you.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, now we're down a rabbit hole here.
I feel like this is the same argument as the argument that a meat robot can't have propositional content or intentionality or aboutness.
It's the same free will thing, yeah.
It's all just meat robots talking to meat robots, right? And honestly, that's what materialism degenerates into. And
But I don't see the problem here. So like,
I don't think we're meat robots.
So I see, like, if we're meat robots versus soul robots or soul thingies, there's no difference. What we're made of. We're made of meat robots. Well, robot is just it's not the point of the argument. If we're made of meat versus made of soul,
robots is the core.
Machines driven by homunculi.
So let me flesh out the argument
we are
here.
Not machines.
Let me flesh out the argument here.
Fundamentally machines.
So it doesn't make a difference if we're made of meat or made of soul stuff. It makes no difference. Either one is capable of doing everything else the other one can do. The only difference is we have evidence of meat stuff. We have no evidence of soul stuff. So anything you think can be done with soul stuff can be done with meat stuff too.
Sure. What is the Thomistic definition of a soul?
I have no idea.
Right, then how can you say there's no evidence for it if you don't know what it is?
Because I've researched the topic quite thoroughly, and there's no evidence of anything outside of the material world. So if you're saying, well, if you're saying soul stuff is material stuff, like, okay, that'd be cool.
No, I mean, no, I'm saying if you don't know what a soul is, how could you possibly say that there's no evidence for it? It's just
well, I don't know what the Thomistic definition of a soul is, but I know what the classical definition of a soul is, which is a non-physical substance that entails consciousness. Non-physical substance that entails consciousness.
Yeah, that's the Cartesian view of the soul. It's not one that I accept.
You didn't ask me about what you said. You asked me the definition of a soul.
Is that the soul is the intelligible principle of a body. Essentially, the soul is that which distinguishes a living body from a dead body. St. Thomas called it the first activity, meaning it's the activities of the body that make it different from a dead body.
So bacteria.
So the soul is, yes, definitely. Anything living has a soul. I mean, their souls have very little activity in terms of there's no sign that they have intellect and things like that. But every living thing has a soul.
Does a virus have a soul?
And I mean by soul. Yeah, sure. Any living thing that. Well, yes, they are in my perspective. Yes, I mean there's some debate. Philosophers of science debate about that. The traditional Thomistic definition of life is that which strives for its own ends, that acts to its own betterment in some sense. And viruses reproduce, so they act for their own betterment. Whereas a rock doesn't really act for its own betterment in any meaningful way. It doesn't try to make itself a better rock. It just sits there. So anything that strives.
And so does this striving that the viruses have, is this outside of the four fundamental forces and known physics? Is this something in addition to those?
It's not a physical force. It's explained in Aristotle's four causes: material, efficient, formal, and final causes. So living things have final causes. They have things in them that make them act to ends, like viruses try to reproduce. That's their thing. People have debates on podcasts, and living things have ends. They have goals. Whereas inanimate things don't have goals.
And you're saying that this goal is an existing quality in the universe, not just a abstract label we give to the fact that it moves.
te- teleology pervades the universe. We see it everywhere. We see it everywhere. We see it in every electron that behaves according to quantum mechanical mathematics is behaving in a teleological sense. Now, of course, the electron isn't alive and doesn't have a soul.
What do you mean by teleology?
It's God's mind. That's where teleology comes from.
What do you mean by a teleological sense? So teleology is design, but why do you think any of those have a design feature to them? The fact that they act in a particular way isn't evidence of design.
Yeah. Well, yes, that goes to Aquinas' fifth, and his way he explained by an example. He said, if you see arrows flying through the air that consistently, not necessarily always, but usually hit a target, the fact that they seem to be directed to a target implies an archer. That is, that if you find processes that tend to one end rather than other ends, that tending to one end implies purpose, implies design. In animate objects, the design comes from the animal itself, like my design is to make an argument. In inanimate things like electrons and rocks and things like that, the design comes from the mind of God. That's his fifth way of demonstrating God's existence.
Okay, so God's nature seems to have a purpose. Who designed God?
God is not designed. He's the source of existence.
So you actually don't need to have a direction that needs purpose. So you just disproved Aquinas' fifth way. Okay, cool.
Yeah, none of these ideas apply to God in anything except an analogical sense. Aquinas described three ways that you can understand something: analogically, univocally, or equivocally. Univocally means exactly the same, and that's not what we're talking about. Analogy means that we can draw analogies, but it's not exactly the same, and equivocal means that it's not the same at all. When we talk about God, everything is analogical because we have no direct access to God, intellectually or by our senses.
It's called special pleading. So you're special pleading for God, saying God is an exception to the rule. Why can't you just make up a different exception and say, okay, you don't need this for the laws of physics?
Oh, no. It's not special pleading. It's saying that there is an existence that is outside of nature that explains nature, and that's not special pleading. That's inference to best explanation.
So there's an explanation outside of God that explains God. That's inference to the best explanation too.
No, there's nothing outside of God.
There's nothing outside of nature.
Well, that's your argument, but then you leave nature unexplained, and nature is not necessarily something that does not need explanation. In fact, I think it does need explanation. God, by his nature, does not need explanation. He is the source of existence.
So you assume that God doesn't need an explanation. I think God does need an explanation, and I think the nature, by its definition, is its own source and doesn't need a thing. So I can just repeat everything you just said verbatim and just switch the nouns.
The reason that you say that God needs an explanation is because you don't understand the arguments that Aquinas and other theologians have put forth. And I agree, they're difficult arguments. But
I understand them perfectly well, and I understand why they don't work, like most philosophers. So we can repeat the arguments for nature and have them work equally as well for nature.
I wouldn't say you understand them perfectly well. I think that's a bit much. I mean, Thomistic scholars don't understand them perfectly well, and you certainly don't. The arguments are profound and subtle, and but they make a lot of sense. I think the idea that the universe just exists for no cause is an argument that falls way short of credibility.
Kind of like saying that God exists with no cause. It seems to also fall even shorter.
Right. Well, it is in the nature of God that cause does not apply to him, because God is, as St. Thomas said, that in which existence is the same as essence. That is, what he is existence.
And you don't see why you can't just literally say the same thing about nature.
Right. I mean, the reason you can't say it about nature is that the nature demonstrates changeability. It demonstrates dependence. It demonstrates all kinds of things that are not the kind of thing that would be true of an entity that was the ground of existence. The ground of existence has to be something that is metaphysically simple, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. That is God. That's not nature.
It seems like you're begging the question, making up a bunch of criteria that aren't required at all for the metaphysical necessity thing. And you said, well, I've made up this new property that I think must be there because I think it's God. But there's no evidence to support any of those things are actually required.
It's not really. It's not a new property. It's a property that has been discussed by theologians and philosophers for thousands of years.
By new, I just want to clarify. I mean thing there's no evidence for. I know you're not making this up. I know that it's made up by other theologians in the past. By new property, I mean thing that hasn't been demonstrated to exist yet, independent of human imagination.
Right. But when you say that there's no evidence for it, you don't think that teleology is evidence for a mind in the universe?
No, it's definitively not. We can prove it's not.
How is it that electrons follow quantum mechanical laws, which are intricate mathematical laws, but electrons don't understand mathematics? How do they behave in accordance with these laws?
It's determined by the physical structure. Determined by physical structure.
That isn't saying anything. How is it that electrons follow the physical structure? Why do they behave in that fashion?
Because they're determined by the physical structure. So it's like the same thing of asking, why does God follow his nature? Because it's his nature.
No. I'm asking about electrons. How do electrons,
nature.
To put it colloquially, how do electrons know quantum mechanics?
They don't know anything. They're just falling like rocks. They are affected by the forces.
Right. So what makes them do it?
The forces
they don't know
make them do it.
If they don't know forces, what makes the forces the forces? What makes the
Their
forces
nature?
do what the forces
What makes
do?
God? His nature.
So this is the whole teleological argument for God's existence, that the presence of consistency, of goal-directed behavior in nature, implies an intellect that is the source of that goal-directed behavior. The intellect isn't in the electron, although the panpsychists will sometimes make that argument. The intellect is in God. There's an intellect working there.
There's not. There's no evidence of intellect in teleology. Like I've literally had conversations with experts on the teleological argument in every field. This is not a thing.
So you don't think that the mathematical structure of quantum mechanics implies an intellectual source?
No, it has a pattern, and we describe it with a language called math. The fact that there is a pattern in reality does not mean that an intellectual source must have created the pattern. The pattern could just be a part of the nature of reality. Like God has a pattern. God is not a random jumbled mess.
Would you say the pattern is complex, intricate, and elegant?
Sure, I guess.
Where does the complexity, intricacy, and elegance come from, or is that just something else that happens to happen? It's
part of its nature, just like you think it's part of God's nature. So the same answer that you apply to God applies to nature every single time.
Is nature intelligent?
Nope.
Are you a panpsychist? So where does intelligence come from?
Emergent property.
Does intelligence come from? Emergent property is like magic.
Property.
Magic, right?
No, I mean, it's a combination of things that don't have intelligence that combine in such a way that produces a process of intelligence. It's not magic. There's no God stuff here. There's no spirit. This is all really stuff. We know emergence is a thing.
No. Intelligence is at the most rudimentary level.
No, it's not.
It's not.
There's no evidence to support that.
Yeah. You don't think quantum mechanics is intelligent?
No, quantum mechanics is just a function of reality. There's no intelligence behind it.
I see. So you could get a PhD in it without really studying very hard?
The fact, like, you can get a PhD in gender studies. That doesn't mean gender studies intelligent, or history doesn't mean history is intelligent. Like, the fact that you can get a degree in it doesn't mean it's intelligent. The thing itself that you're studying is not intelligent because it requires intelligence to get a degree.
You don't think there's intelligence in quantum mechanics and general relativity? Just patterns.
Those are descriptions of things of reality. They're descriptions, words that describe things.
Right. And there's no intelligence manifested in reality.
No, there's no intelligence in quantum mechanics itself. Quantum mechanics does not have a brain or intelligence. It is a pattern in reality.
and it doesn't manifest intelligence.
I don't know, like it creates it emergently from other things.
Evidence, no, it's not evidence of intelligence.
No, it's not evidence that there's intelligence before or preceding or inside quantum mechanics. No.
Okay, so you think it just happened?
Yeah, I think it's a part of its nature, just like you think God's nature just happened.
Yeah, it just seems to me like you're running from something. That's really the sense I get here, is that it's so freaking obvious, and you're just dancing. You're just dancing like Bojangles. You're just all over the place on this. There's massive intelligence in the most fundamental processes in the universe that we're still discovering, and it's beautiful and it's elegant and it's real. And
do you think that any
intelligence comes from somewhere?
Do you think that any pattern equals intelligence? Is that your argument? Pattern equals intelligence?
Yes, definitely. That's the whole teleological argument. That's Aquinas' fifth way. Any pattern.
Okay, so does any pattern equals intelligence? All right. Well,
yes,
that's silly. So then, therefore, if there's no intelligence, there must inherently be randomness. But randomness itself would also be a pattern. And so, no, there's nothing that we could see could ever be indicative of no intelligence. So nothing that could ever be could not be intelligent, because there's always going to be a pattern. And that literally violates the laws of logic to not be a pattern.
Oh no! As a matter of fact, that's an interesting way of demonstrating the existence of God. That even randomness would require reference to a pattern of some sort, which would imply God. You can't get away from God, no matter how hard you try.
So if there wasn't a God, how would you identify it? How do you make your hypothesis falsifiable?
That's a very good question. The existence of nature as it is now, there is no theory in nature as thoroughly proven as God's existence. Even just from the first way. Aquinas' first way says that in order to explain change in nature, you have to posit a prime mover, given that nature is by definition that which changes. Every change in nature, every electron, every proton, every grain of dust that blows is proof of God's existence.
So my question.
So yeah, it's inconceivable how you could not arrive at God's existence if you think carefully about what's going on around us.
So my question is if there's two hypotheses, X and Y, and you say in order to say my hypothesis is X and not Y, you would have to show some way to differentiate between them, right? So if you're saying that everything you see, no matter what it is always going to be evidence of your hypothesis, then there's absolutely nothing that you could imagine that could be seen that could ever show the opposite of your hypothesis. That means you're begging the question, because you've said there's no way to differentiate.
Nope. If change didn't occur in nature, if nature had no change in it whatsoever, then Aquinas' first way wouldn't prove God's existence. So yes, if nature was frozen and there was no change, then the first way would not be an adequate way to prove God's existence, because the first way depends upon the presence of change in nature.
Right.
But
so
it
it's
shows
like
but it shows you how powerful the proof is. It shows you that the proof is so powerful that the only way it couldn't be true is if there was no change in nature.
It actually shows how terrible it is. So like if you've heard of Paley's watchmaker argument, the one where he walks on a beach and he finds a watch and he says, this watch must have been designed.
Sure.
If when you see the watch, you tell it's designed, is because you look at it and you say, oh, this watch is different from the sand. The sand doesn't look designed. The water doesn't look designed. The trees don't look designed. The watch looks different. But if everything was a watch, if all you saw was watches, you couldn't conclude the watch was designed, because it's the exact same as everything else you see. There's no difference between it. So you can't differentiate it between design and not design, because there's literally only one thing you see, which is just design. So there's no way to differentiate between design and not design. So
I'm not defending. I don't defend Paley's argument.
Right. This is just an analogy. It's just I'm not saying you're defending Paley's argument. The problem here is that if you're saying the same thing about randomness versus non-randomness, that in order for something to be evidence of a God, it has to have any pattern at all, including randomness, then essentially you have the same problem here, because you're saying no matter what you see, it's all watches. They're all watches. So how do you differentiate between watch and non-watch? How would you show that this wasn't designed? Because you're just saying anything that's there, even if it wasn't designed, you're going to call it design, because no matter what you see, your definition of design just entails it's there, therefore design.
Right.
We'll probably have to move on. So let's have Michael reply to that, and then maybe we can move on.
Yeah, the make is a good point. That is that randomness itself intrinsically implies the presence of goal-directed behavior in some sense, because randomness wouldn't be intelligible if it couldn't be compared to some kind of goal-directed behavior. Nonetheless, what we observe around us is goal-directed behavior of an uncommonly elegant, complex, intricate form in physics, in nature. And the inference that comes from an intellect that is outside of nature is the obvious inference, and I think is obviously true.
So there was the question of, who created God, or what's the explanation for God? So I think and explanations, you got to bottom out somewhere. So the question is, at some point, any worldview is going to appeal to mystery. So you might do it with what was that word? The tetrahedron or whatever.
Oh,
amplitude.
Amplitude. Or you might do it with God.
Which is the atheist God. Right.
So the question is, which is the more appropriate place to appeal to mystery, or to say this is just fundamental and we don't have any. This does explaining, but it itself is not explained. So maybe you can each give an answer to that. Do you want to start, T-Jump?
What was the question?
So would you agree that every worldview is going to bottom out somewhere and have an explanation which is itself not explained?
Sort of. There are definitely many that have past infinite regresses. Like that's the consensus in physics right now, that there's past infinite regresses. Most models have that. Like in Sean Carroll's debate with William Lane Craig, he did like a Google search for 30 minutes, found 17 of them. So not necessarily, like there are some that have infinite regresses. I prefer the ones that do have a first mover. Those mine is naturalistic pantheism. That's the one I go with. But yeah, most of them do, but not all of them. Most of them in physics don't.
So whatever the foundation is, where you have something that does the explaining, but it itself is a mystery in a sense. How do you justify that on your worldview, Tom?
Justify what?
What was the tetrahedron thing?
Amplitude. Like that's
amplitude. So whatever it is that's at the bottom, how do you justify? So what's the explanation for the amplitude? So, and then you give an explanation for that, and Michael can just ask, what's the explanation for that? So you're doing that for Michael's view with God, and we'll have him give an answer for that. But the same question applies to you for your worldview.
So my answer is my strategy is I essentially just mirror theistic responses. So for Thomism, I'm just going to take their answers and just repeat them verbatim and just replace the noun God with naturalistic pantheism, which is eternal, all-powerful nature, but no consciousness, no omnipresence, no omni-knowledge, no omni-morality. So you can essentially get the exact same results or answers to all of the different Thomistic arguments by replacing God with a non-conscious, eternal, all-powerful entity of nature, just a different force, quantum field, whatever you want to call it. And so my response to justify that would just be to copy the Thomistic response. God is justified by his own nature. He's outside of space-time. He doesn't need one of those. And so I can just repeat all of that and just put it into a part of the naturalistic pantheism's nature. Say, it's outside of nature. It doesn't need an explanation. It's the thing that created nature. And so even though I don't think any of these are good arguments, I can repeat them verbatim to create an answer that is just as good or better than God.
I mean, so you can do that as a parallel argument, but presumably you have a worldview or you just say you don't have an explanation, but it's still, you're going to have some point where your explanations bottom out. And how do you justify ending there and not having an infinite regress? Or because the question, presumably you think the question which you posed to Michael is valid of, well, what explains God? So if that's a valid question, then it's either it's okay when you do it and it's okay when Michael does it, or it's not okay when you do it and it's not okay when Michael does it. Do you see my point?
Yeah, it's not okay when either of us do it. So my position is that we should start with our epistemic means and build on those and never make any conclusions about the fundamental nature of reality. That's the reasonable thing to do. So if you're trying to make a conclusion about the fundamental nature of reality and you have arguments to do it, those arguments are going to work for any of the possible hypotheses you can come up with, pretty much. And there's going to be better ones always. The ones that most reflect the stuff we have are going to be the better ones. But I think that entire enterprise is philosophically flawed. Like, it's kind of a waste of time. You're not going to get anywhere to it. The correct way is to follow science and to keep following science. And as far as science goes, is where you have to stop and say, we don't know what's next. And then we're done.
Right. So it could be the case that we follow science and it points us to some version of a deity. You know, it might not have all the details fleshed out, which we would get from, you know, the knowledge that's presented through a religious tradition, but it might point to that. And if that's where the evidence points, then would it not be reasonable to say, okay, well, this is as far as we can go with our explanations. It points to this, and this is either the foundation of reality or it's just the frontier of our knowledge, and we stop here, or we're going to keep pushing. But currently, this is the current best explanation. In other words,
yeah, absolutely. If there was some new evidence that actually indicated a God that no one's discovered yet, and then yeah, for sure, we could conclude a God and be reasonable. There just isn't any.
Yeah, you want to comment on this, Michael?
Yeah, I think it's not a bad synopsis of what atheism is, in that it is the evasion of answering really fundamental questions about existence. It certainly was what I did as an atheist, so I can certainly understand the motivation for an atheist to say, hey, you know, let's not really think about where things really came from. It's kind of what atheism is. What came by logically as the ground of reality was discussed in great detail by Thomas Aquinas in Summa Contra Gentiles. It's like 100 pages of the modern translations. And he pointed out that when you look at prime mover argument, the first cause argument, the necessary existence argument, the quality argument in his fourth way, and the design argument in his fifth way, that there are certain characteristics of the ground of existence, the most fundamental existing thing, that cannot be a part of nature. I'm sorry, the most fundamentally existing thing must be unchanging, must be uncaused, must depend on nothing else for its existence, must be infinitely good, and must be a supernatural intelligence. And he pointed out that, hey, that's what all men call God. So nature can't be the most fundamentally existing thing, and God is the most fundamentally existing thing.
Do you want to reply to that, T-Jump? We'll go to questions in a minute. Oh, first we can get you guys to each summarize your arguments and your view.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that all of the assertions about God are just blind assertions, like, and nothing more. You're just conceptually analyzing things, making up categories, and saying with your made up categories, this is the conclusion. And I mean, I totally agree what he said about atheism being the position that we don't answer anything about fundamental questions. Like, yeah, that is the best intellectual position. Like, we don't know. We have no evidence to support what the fundamental nature of reality is, none whatsoever. And we're all just kind of making stuff up. And so it's better to withhold judgment. And the best way to address these is to say, well, can we parallel these arguments to a mutually exclusive conclusion? If we can, then that argument doesn't tell us anything about the fundamental nature of reality, and we can do that with every single one of them. So the best position is to just say we don't know, and that is the most genuine position. So yeah, I just think that all the arguments for the fundamental nature, especially being a God, are just kind of arbitrary things that can work for anything that we make up, and so there's not really any evidence one way or the other.
Michael, would you like to give a summary in 5 minutes or so?
Yeah, sure. My view is as opposite as one can get. The evidence for God's existence is everywhere. Every electron that moves, every proton that moves, everything that's caused, everything that exists on a scale of better or worse, everything that has any kind of pattern of behavior is evidence for God's existence. The evidence for God's existence is massive, plentiful, continuous, and undeniable. Undeniable rationally. Atheism is a form of ignorance, but it's culpable, meaning to be an atheist, one has to try not to see what's going on in the world. What's going on in the world is a beautiful, elegant, astonishing mind that's manifested in the world around us. I'm embarrassed that I spent 45 years not believing that, because I was very wrong.
You are muted.
Where is it? It hasn't come through in here yet. Where was it?
Me or Tom?
Gonna come.
Our
First
unit
question
was
is for
muted.
T-Jump. I'll click on it when it comes through. It's a little bit of a delay. I'm
Okay.
looking at it on YouTube.
Sure.
For T-Jump, a person looks at a pink elephant. You then cut the brain in the right spot and lie on a special paper. Has it come through yet?
Yep.
No.
Radiometric paper, and you can see the pink elephant, which is what's actually a shape done by, I think it was monkeys. They did it on monkeys, where they showed them an image, put a radiometric dye in their brain, cut the brain open, and found the image in the brain. And you can find the reference for this in my conversation with Eric Hernandez, where there's a link to a conversation on Sean Carroll's podcast where they went in and talked about this. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's projection of images in the brain that very clearly happens. Although we still don't have a good explanation for how that actually allows us to see things. That is, that you can shine images on brain tissue. It doesn't. Well, how does that mean that you can see it? So there's still very profound questions as to what the nature of perception is. But yes, perception is semanotopically oriented in many cases.
So there was another question. It was from earlier from Church of Entropy. Question for T-Jump. Where is the empirical evidence for that consciousness can have a boundary, i.e. that non-conscious regions are well defined?
It's the fact that your consciousness can't do anything outside of your brain. Like, I can't lift my TV. That's pretty good evidence that your consciousness is bounded.
Well, we lift TVs all the time by using this, or we can ask someone to lift it for us. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to get things done in the physical. We just do it in a roundabout way. Still conscious.
Jan thinks that consciousness actually goes, like, I know her, Church of Entropy. She's someone we talk with, and so she thinks that consciousness goes outside of the brain, like your consciousness extends further than your body, kind of a thing. That's what she's asking.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's there's a philosophical perspective that I actually think it makes sense in a lot of ways. That what the brain does is not generate consciousness; it limits consciousness, it focuses consciousness. That human consciousness is in fact larger than what we experience. That certainly is the experience of people who've had near-death experiences, spiritual experiences.
Antangelo's asking from Mike Egnor, please do more debates on major platforms like Modern Day Debate. You're one of the best and well-informed defenders of theism I've seen.
Oh, thank you, Mom. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very nice thing.
I've been hogging him lately. What's the next one? Josh Wolf, question. How does the image of infinity, the dots that go out on it, that go on out of view, distinguish more than 9,000 from infinity? It seems that dots require some additional property and is reconstructed.
Yeah, it's multiple concepts in the brain. So there's multiple concepts for infinity. One is the dots, and it's just not stopping. 9,000 is the dots, and it's stopping at some point with some relation to 10 and 9.
Well, multiple concepts are not infinite concepts. Infinity is not multiple. Infinity is infinite. So it's still a different thing.
And then another one from Josh Wolf. Question for Mike. What is the mystical idealism that you mentioned at the outset of the discussion?
Mystical idealism. Goodness gracious.
Well, your version of idealism or Thomistic dualism, or you said you didn't want to get into it because it would take time.
I refer to a personal mystical experience. Is that what they're referring to?
No, I think he means your Thomistic dualism. I think he wants an explanation of your.
Oh, sure. Thomistic dualism is sometimes also called hylomorphic dualism, and it is a form. There are three common forms of dualism: Cartesian dualism, property dualism, and Thomistic dualism. Cartesian dualism is the idea that the mind is a separate substance from the body, and it's like a ghost in a machine. I'm not a Cartesian dualist. Property dualism is the viewpoint that mental states are basically properties of physical states, but don't have power in themselves to change things. Thomistic dualism is the idea that the mind is the form of the body. The mind is the intelligible principle that gives rise to the body. It comes from the Aristotelian notion of hylomorphism, which is a metaphysical way of understanding the world. So it's kind of a complex issue, but Thomistic dualism, I think, fits very nicely into neuroscience. So that's why I'm a Thomistic dualist.
And then another one for Mike. If I wanted to argue for dualism, which is the best argument that doesn't reference a failure in materialism?
That's a very good question. There are tons of arguments for dualism. I think metaphysical simplicity is a good argument. The idea that the brain can be split, but the mind cannot be split in anything like the same way. The idea that qualia, that the first-person experience of taste and smell and vision is not a property of matter, so it implies a different process. The immateriality of abstract thought, the idea that we can think of logic and perfect things like infinity and triangularity, argues for something that's not material, and that argues for something immaterial. The idea that intentionality is that our thoughts are about things, matter is never about anything, and the idea that we quite obviously have free will are all very strong arguments in favor of dualism or even of idealism, but mainly dualism. I think near-death experiences are very strong arguments in favor of dualism or idealism of some sort.
Everyone Needs a Smile is asking, T-Jump, if you knew for certain that a God existed but were not revealed its properties, what do you think it would be like given current evidence?
What if I knew for certain that God existed but didn't know what its properties were? That seems like a contradiction in terms, like, because God implies consciousness, so you'd have to know what its properties were. But maybe, I guess if he's asking if I know there is a necessary, if he's asking if I have to grant that there's a necessary being who's conscious, what would I think it's like? Either I would think it would be a malicious kid playing with toys kind of thing, just murdering people at random, or it would be apathetic and not care about anyone or anything. So if there was a consciousness that created the universe, it would either be evil or apathetic.
Cool. I think that was the last question, unless one's just come in. No, so there's probably some that we missed from earlier in the stream, but we started taking questions quite late. Did you guys want to give a final summary, or have you already done that?
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mike, for having the conversation. It was enjoyable, but heated conversation. I really appreciate it.
And I thank Tom as well. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you for joining. And it was very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks both of you. It was a great discussion. Lots of activity in the chat. So Michael Egnor will be debating Matt Dillahunty on God's existence in, I think it's about a month's time. I've got a stream tomorrow on the demarcation problem with Seth Hart, who that topic's included in his PhD. The demarcation problem basically is how do you decide what's science and what's pseudoscience. So it should be interesting. If you look, you can probably see the ant on my mic. So if you like this kind of stuff, be sure to subscribe. Give us a like and a comment to help us in the algorithm, and